The Simpsons is a pop culture institution, standing as a cornerstone of television for... Oh my god! Why haven't they stopped? The explosive success of the most famous TV family of all time has generated a plethora of tie-in merchandise. Comics, mugs, shirts, and who could forget Bootleg Bart?
I resent that.
Perhaps the most well-recognized part of the merchandise mountain is the tie-in games. These games are rightly remembered as key parts of many childhoods, except for one tiny hiccup.
They're all shite!
Well, no, that's not true, but they're not exactly flawless either. Even the objectively best Simpsons game, Eggs for Bart. Look, I know this isn't going to make me a lot of friends, but the actual objectively best Simpsons game, Simpsons Hit and Run, just isn't as good as you remember. Dislike the video all you want, fuckle nuts. It still counts as engagement in the algorithm's eyes. You're paying me for the privilege of expressing your disgust. I mean, you're not paying me much, but you are paying me. Now, I know what you're thinking, and I get it. You think it is. I know you think it is. I know you're sitting there thinking, damn, I really liked that game. It was so good. Ugh, I should replay that. Someone should make a remaster of that game. It was so good. I'm going to dig out my PS2 and boot up Hit and Run while I listen to Marriage Story in the background to recreate the sweet memories of childhood. It's fine to want to relive fond memories of better times. And also, what do I know? I work from home and I do YouTube on the side. I'm becoming isolated and weird. But trust me on this one, Simpsons Hit and Run has aged like a fine... Mulk? Don't get me wrong, I loved this game growing up. I really did. Between this and Road Trip Adventure and Shadow of the Colossus, these games make up a huge chunk of my mid to late childhood. Despite giving this video this title, I still love it. This game commands such a status in the annals of history. Someone's building an entire Simpsons Hit and Run API so we can teach AI to play this game. God, Atwood's Law really is a law, isn't it? Which is why I hate to do this. But I think it's worth pointing out that when we talk about how Simpsons Hit and Run is an unexpected masterpiece or the greatest game ever made, it's the nostalgia goggles talking. To me, a good indicator of whether or not a game holds up is whether you'd recommend someone plays it in the current year. So, Deus Ex holds up. The first two Fallouts and Fallout New Vegas hold up. Half-Life holds up, but only after you make an hour and 20-minute video where you complain Half-Life gives you simulation sickness and how much better the Black Mesa revamp is, only to be told that you can just set the FOV in Half-Life to 105, which gets rid of the simulation sickness, so you've just tripped on your dick in front of the whole internet. Simpsons Hit and Run doesn't hold up, which I know will be a huge disappointment for 8-year-old Soup to hear. But 8-year-old Soup is a dick, and it's my job to speak truth to power. Besides, I'm a white male aged 18 to 49. Everyone listens to me, no matter how dumb my suggestions are. So, in today's opinion piece, masquerading as media analysis, because that's what every video essay analyzing media is unless you're following ideas, don't forget that, I'm gonna kill the inner child inside you that thinks Hit and Run is still good. Okay, time for some qualifying statements. So, if you didn't just hit dislike and run away after seeing the title of this video, or if you're one of the elite 50% of people who watch past the first 30 seconds, then I'm guessing you're at least willing to hear me out. So let me qualify my opening statement. I'm going to spend the next couple of hours of my finite life heaping praise on a game I've just said doesn't hold up. And I'm going to spend even more time complaining about features and design choices I actually have quite nuanced feelings about. Being too harsh to this game feels wrong somehow. Almost every Simpsons game feels shovelware adjacent. You know what I mean, the kind of game where it looks like it was put together on a weekend and is cashing in on a recognizable IP in the hopes of being purchased by your unsuspecting uncle for Christmas so he can finally be the cool uncle for once and you just have to politely feign excitement lest you ruin another Christmas. Simpsons Hit and Run is the closest in spirit and competency to what a Simpsons game should be. It stands head and shoulders above these Simpsons games by being something a human would actually want to play. I mean, Hit and Run doesn't become unbearably meta about itself. And it doesn't end with you having to play Dance Dance Revolution against God. For that, it deserves a fucking prize. Simpsons Hit and Run is by no means bad. It's a perfectly cromulent game. If I were to describe it, it'd be a hot mess express. Choo choo. What's fascinating too is that many of the devs on the team who made the game had the same observation. In 2021, the game's source code, along with a whole host of other useful resources like design documentation and internal company communications, leaked online. Now, I ain't no big fancy lawyer man, but just in case it is a crime to read the code and documentation, I definitely didn't read the documentation.
However,
If someone were to hypothetically read the documentation to me, and if the person who hypothetically read that documentation to me was also me, it was hypothetically very gratifying, because it basically confirmed a lot of my notes on the game. Based on what was revealed in the milestone documents, even the later ones, a lot of the designers felt the game lacked a good structure and pace, while others were unclear on what hit-and-run play, rewards, mission flow, objective story, the game really was. In many ways, those fears proved unfounded. There are aspects of this game which really work, where the game's controls and mechanics create a fun experience that really holds up. I can boot this game up and have a great time playing it, and it perfectly captures the feeling of classic Simpsons. Back when it was good. It's easy to see why this game is still such a touchstone for so many of us, and why it still has such a dedicated following. Hell, the only reason I could do this retrospective is because the dedicated people over at the Donut team made the PC version of the game work on modern hardware, setting up modern aspect ratios, adding some graphical enhancements, fixing glitches, and physics issues. Simpsons Hit and Run is a great game, wrapped inside a bad game. Overall, the game is less than the sum of its parts. I suspect part of the reason the game is such a hot mess express is down to the pressure from higher-ups at Fox and other kinds of business meddling that existed because of the economics around game making in the early 2000s. But business meddling or no, these choices mean the game is often grindy and controller-bitingly frustrating. A lot of the design choices don't make sense unless considered as byproducts of the era, and other parts of the game feel tacked on. These aren't fixed by quality of life improvements made by a dedicated modding community, they're kind of a core problem. And we ignore that at our peril. It's important to acknowledge this stuff, not just as a unique quirk of gaming history when we look back at the one good Simpsons game, but because a Simpsons Hit and Run remaster is one of the most requested games remasters out there. Simpsons Hit and Run currently exists as abandonware, in that it's not supported in any official capacity and is out of print, but it's not an orphaned work, because you can trace the inheritance of ownership. The game was developed by Radical Entertainment in partnership with Fox Interactive and published by Vivendi Games, unless you were born with the curse of being British or living in a PAL region, in which case it was released under Sierra Entertainment. Now, we don't live in the Chaos with Ed Miliband timeline, so Radical Entertainment was acquisitioned by Vivendi Games, which was then acquisitioned by Activision, before Radical was hacked into tiny pieces after the failure of Prototype 2 and assimilated into the Activision Borg Cube, and Activision Blizzard is soon to be assimilated into the Microsoft Borg Cube. So this is Future Soup here. This took so long to make, the UK competition watchdog moved to block Microsoft's takeover of Activision Blizzard. Oops. Future Soup here. The EU approved the merger. Why am I like this? Okay, I really shouldn't have opened this door. Meanwhile, Sierra Entertainment was dissolved in 2008, Fox Interactive went defunct in 2006, and Fox, now owned by Disney, gave the rights on future Simpsons games to EA of all companies back in 2005. And we all know how well that went. Which means a Simpsons Hit and Run remaster lies between the Mat, the Mouse, and the Microsoft, unless the license for all future games passing to EA sends the complicated corporate octopi to fight a court battle over who gets to publish this potential riverbed full of gold. Now, any remaster would need the sign-off of all 3, 4, 6 of these entities, but if the spreadsheet said yes to a remaster being a viable business proposition, then their path of least resistance would be a simple graphical upgrade. I think. I have no idea if any of that is accurate, but I sounded convincing saying it, didn't I? Always cross-reference the YouTubers you watch. Games like Black Mesa can get away with preserving Half-Life's skeletal structure and prettifying the skin because A, they're building on a solid foundation, and B, the graphical enhancement doesn't exist for the sake of it. It also enhances the story and the gameplay. Half-Life's surface tension can't communicate the same sense of shit-meeting fan that Black Mesa's surface tension can. Whereas rebuilding the Simpsons Hit and Run in Unreal Engine won't change the jankier parts of the game that need overhauling. And it's important to reappraise the media we like. Gaming's moved on a lot since 2003. What's worth keeping or modifying? What needs to be overhauled? What have we learned in the 20+ years since this game came out? Because it's almost guaranteed that Simpsons Hit and Run is not as good as you remember. Sorry. YouTuber reviewer convention dictates that the only way to talk about media is to painstakingly retell the story of the thing you're analyzing. Bonus points the closer you get to describing the plot in real time. In theory, this is supposed to lay the groundwork for more in-depth analysis, like themes or characterization or parallels to the real world, or to serve as an interesting discussion of the game mechanics or level design. In theory being the operative phrase there. Half-Life, yes, I'm using Black Mesa footage, sue me, takes a blended approach to story and gameplay by making them self-reinforcing. The game demands on the player increase as the situation at Black Mesa spirals out of control. Combat and gameplay shift in service of the story as your skills develop, your arsenal grows, and you metamorphosize from scientist to soldier. You can't really talk about Half-Life without talking about this story-gameplay symbiosis. Simpsons Hit and Run treats story and gameplay as two separate pillars. Gameplay only reinforces story in the most basic way. Complete this thing to unlock this chunk of story. Conversely, stripping the story out entirely wouldn't hurt gameplay. That's just road rage too. I don't think this is a bad choice for the game. In fact, I think this approach was critical in making Hit and Run work at all. When approaching how to talk about this game, the way that made the most sense was to talk about story and gameplay individually. But as I was putting my thoughts down onto paper, I realized the story of Hit and Run, as in the nuts and bolts plot and themes, isn't all that important. The story could have been anything. Because the thing that people really love about a Simpsons game is far more ephemeral. You have to get the vibes right. The Simpsons are unique characters with their own personalities and quirks. The most important thing for a Simpsons game to do is to communicate those as faithfully as possible. It has to feel like a Simpsons game, not just a game in the Simpsons skin. The skin says... As proof of that, let me offer up Road Rage as an example. Road Rage isn't a good game for reasons we'll get into later, a lot later, and the story amounts to little more than set dressing. Mr. Burns has bought all the buses in Springfield and replaced them with atomic buses, and the citizens of Springfield decide to use their cars to taxi around residents and earn enough money to buy the buses back from Mr. Burns. This entire story is communicated through 2 minutes worth of cutscenes, but Radical makes those cutscenes count. The humor of the game is a perfectly cromulent adaptation of the TV shows.
Behold the Burns Atomic Megabus. Faster, cheaper, and completely safe.
Please kill me.
That poor man. I hope someone does kill him.
The fact the story was shallow set dressing didn't really matter, because the game sold it to me through the strength of the character writing. I totally buy the idea Burns would buy all the buses in Springfield and convert them to run on nuclear power. I totally buy the idea that Homer would do a get-rich-quick scheme as a taxi driver off the back of that. And the people you pick up feel like characters from the show.
Let's go, Mac. Haven't got all day.
Can you take me home? Thieves stole my police car.
This is what I mean when I say the vibes are important for the functioning of a Simpsons game. Road Rage gameplay sucks and the story is non-existent, but there is a real Simpsons spirit in there, and that spirit is what elevated the game, made it memorable. But because Simpsons spirit is a squishy, wobbly thing to define, talking about how the game feels makes it really hard to critically analyze, because it's hard to organize your thoughts and feelings around vibes. Complicating matters is the fact that there is Simpsons spirit and Simpsons spirit, which means any conversation about Simpsons games has to at least acknowledge the fact the Simpsons ain't what she used to be. Newer episodes have their moments. An episode of Newer Simpsons 24 Minutes from Series 18 actually appears in my top 10 list. But, I mean, that data is pretty conclusive. Yet pinning down why is a lot harder, so we're gonna have to go on a detour. Get used to these, by the way, there's like 10 of them in this video. The Simpsons started life as an absurdist parody of the television ecosystem it existed in, where a handful of networks held a stranglehold over broadcasting and produced the same cookie-cutter comedies. The Simpsons was the first not only to skewer them, but to take aim at the underbelly of American society, taking a far more cynical view of that society, its institutions, and the American dream that the sitcoms it grew up around.
Is that a good siren? Am I approved?
You ever known a siren to be good? No, Mr. Simpson, it's not. It's a bad siren. That's the computer, in case I went blind, telling me sell the vehicle to this fella and you're out of business. That's what the siren says.
Oh.
Seems the ultimate behemoth is a wee bit out of your price range. And wee bit is me being polite. You couldn't afford this thing if you lived to be $1 million.
Matt Groening, who came from the underground comedy circuit, helped give The Simpsons its strong anti-authority streak, and the disruption of TV convention is part of what made The Simpsons so successful. But The Simpsons extends far enough back in time where we forget the other ways it was genuinely groundbreaking. This scene from Bart the General is a pattern parody or homage, but if you were in the audience watching this when it was first released, this would likely have been one of the first low-angle shots you would have seen in an animation, considering at the time, a lot of animation that wasn't big blockbuster Disney would have been in the 2D profile of Hanna-Barbera Egyptian hieroglyphics.
When David was collaborating to create the visual language of the show, you were thinking, let's shoot this like a movie. Let's make this dramatic. Let's put in exciting, heroic shots from other movies like Patton and classic military dramas. Like, let's not just put the camera and shoot it like a cartoon sitcom.
TV animation with literally wide shot, medium shot, close-up, all in the flat proscenium, no deep space shot. And Wes and I were totally like, no, the camera's gonna be down here, it's gonna be up here, it's gonna be this way, as long as it works for the joke.
One argument for why The Simpsons went bad is that the dawn of the internet atomized what people were watching, and since there was no longer a pop culture monolith to skewer, The Simpsons became everymen living in a world where no one is. This mismatch, God, that's a hard word to say. This mismatch is perhaps clearest with The Simpsons' economic standing. Homer was built as an economic everyman in 1989, precariously middle class, living in tract housings out in the suburbs. In some respects, Homer has remained an economic everyman. If you take the average across the hundreds of jobs he's held over the show's runtime, Homer's median income never surpasses the median income of the average US citizen. It's also been as stagnant as actual US wages. But as many people have pointed out, the societal shifts that have occurred from the 90s to now mean that The Simpsons have gone from lower middle class to almost unimaginably wealthy materially. Even though, if you adjust Homer's 90s paycheck for inflation and account for the fact that he's the sole provider for a family of 5, they've shifted from tenuously middle class in the 1990s to a low-income family in 2022.
Good heavens! This is a palace! How in the world can you afford to live in a house like this, Simpson?
I don't know. Don't ask me how the economy works.
Other people say that Principal and the Pauper was when The Simpsons became bad because they all read that Dead Homer Society blog and just copied their opinion. I'm joking. People don't like Principal and the Pauper because they feel it undermines the show's own integrity by completely undoing the investment people had in a beloved character, and characters having a consistent through line to them was one of the hallmarks of early Simpsons success. If you look back at episodes like Sweet Seymour Skitter's badass song, when Seymour gets fired, he becomes listless. All he had was the school, and it meant a lot to him. It gave his life meaning. While unemployed, he loses himself in the arts before re-enlisting with the US Army. It portrays Skinner as a bit of a lovable dweeb, a through-and-through square who enjoys structure, and canonizes him as having always been a sergeant in the United States Army. But Principal and the Pauper had him as a private, and when he resigned the principalship, he decided to return to his punk roots instead. Skinner was no longer always an unabashed square. That incongruity bothers people. Others argue it signaled the untethering of the series from reality. Preserving the carefully constructed universe of Springfield was secondary to the goal of producing an episode, and the world could be taken apart and put back together as and when needed with no regard to history.
And I further decree that everything will be just like it was before all this happened, and no one will ever mention it again, under penalty of torture.
I'm more sympathetic to the atomization argument than the idea that Principal and the Pauper was the canary in the coal mine for the show, because a trend that was at least apparent to me was how The Simpsons went from cultural touchstone to trying to play catch-up with cultural shifts in society. A part of this is due to its age. I think it's worth keeping in mind, the show is older than I am. It basically invented the adjective to describe how characters grow into facsimiles of themselves. Flanderization. I don't think I need to say the word. You're knee-deep in a video that's currently tangentially about Simpsons Hit and Run. You know what flanderization is. Earlier Simpsons definitely benefited from a cultural monolith that evolved more slowly than it does today, which allowed it to keep its more subversive edge because it could keep pace with the culture. But as a byproduct of its own success, by the end of the 90s, there were hardly any sitcoms left for it to lampoon. Good modern-day sitcoms, even ones that do revert back to status quo at the end, still sit in the shadow of The Simpsons. The writers' team has been Theseus several times over and over, and the answer is no. No, it's not the same ship. In fact, given how disruptions among writing staff can alter a product's final feel in quite fundamental ways, the natural disruptions that come with a show that's 30 years old means it's basically several different shows. Writers entering the staffing room now will be people who watched The Simpsons, so what The Simpsons was will be filtered through the interpretations of what current writers believe The Simpsons was. It's like how queens like Violet from Drag Race Series 7 were introduced to drag via Drag Race, so their aesthetic and interpretation of what drag is formed from seeing queens on Drag Race, and the show's evolution from subversive to pop culture institution, to the point that the real-life Zodiac Killer can stand up and say Republicans are the party of Homers and Barts.
I think the Democrats are the party of Lisa Simpson, and Republicans are happily the party of Homer and Bart and Maggie and Marge.
Means the center-left anti-authoritarian compass The Simpsons has largely held over the years has been denuded.
All right, men, here's the order of deportations. First, we'll be rounding up your tired, then your poor, then your huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Breathers. Got it.
So, how do you skewer a largely atomized culture where the thing you existed to parody doesn't exist anymore, and your ability to shine a light on the seedy underbelly of America has been co-opted by that same seedy underbelly? This might go some way to explaining why Simpsons jokes have been replaced with pointing at pop culture thing and saying, laugh. That's the clearest detriment of the other Simpsons game everyone forgot about. The Simpsons game. Wow, they actually called it the Simpsons game? I mean, it's the clearest detriment if you ignore the clunky controls, the repetitive gameplay, the janky combat, the weird difficulty curve, the 3D cutscene, uncanny valley Simpsons that contrast with the actually quite nice 2D cutscene animations. For some reason, characters don't stay put when you switch between them, which I understand from a combat perspective, but it makes solving some of the puzzles really annoying. The Simpsons game exists as a parody of gaming and the games industry, but it lacks any sort of sophistication. Its premise is the Simpsons as video game characters coming to understand themselves as pieces of a video game.
Don't you understand, son? Your whole life up until this moment has been a mere video game.
Yeah, what are you gonna do?
And trying to break free from the eventual obsolescence inherent in the industry.
No video game is safe from an industry that's always chasing the hot new thing. Sure, the Simpsons game is great with its unique upgradable character abilities and its hilarious self-referential cutscenes. But what about when the Xbox 720 comes out or the PlayStation 4? No one will want to play as then.
As the game progresses, the game does this by pivoting away from Simpsons game levels in their own right and towards entering other video games with the Simpsons IP slapped on top. Now, this could have been a starting point for playing with the inherent interactivity of video games to take game genres we recognize in fun and clever directions. And then they don't. It gives me Duke Nukem Forever vibes, where they're taking lazy jabs at games which far surpass it in skill and competency.
Power armor is for pussies.
Ha 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 ha. Fuck you! The game takes a while to find its stride. It definitely gets stronger towards the middle, and there is stuff to like in the game. I like that Groening's goons are lawyers when you meet the creator, and I like how the game has like an old Sonic on a treadmill to grind the gears of the video game engine. It's got its funny moments and fun missions, all of them involving Marge, really.
Quimby, you specifically promised me no mobs.
But mostly the game carries this detached cynicism where it's busy making gestures at things you might recognize from other games, asking you to laugh at how silly game cliches are, but not offering a meaty critique or deconstruction of those systems. Its self-awareness is in service of nothing other than to remind you about other, better games that have done something clever or convention-breaking, blissfully unaware of the fact that pointing out cliches doesn't make them any more fun to play. Oh, God, literal God, thinks the camera controls are frustrating too? Ha! Well, imagine if he'd spent the last 10 hours of his finite life having to use them. Just imagine. You're right, guys, this is lazy game design. The game I am playing is bad, and who could forget the pop culture references? It's hard to forget them when the Simpsons game keeps reminding you. Remember when Sideshow Bob stepped on a rake? Remember Mr. Sparkle? Remember Planet of the Apes? Remember Donkey Kong? Remember the Terminator? This is Simpsons spirit, but modern Simpsons spirit. Part of why 24 minutes works as well as it does, and why it's one of the only 5 episodes of newer Simpsons to score higher than 8 on IMDb, by the way, is because it feels like the right kind of parody, one that's born from a deep love of the material it's riffing, one that's seamlessly integrated into Springfield, and one that uses its premise for a lot of good jokes. The joke isn't just 24 exists, remember Donkey Kong? At the same time, Cultural Shifts is an incomplete analysis of how Simpsons lost its luster. Classic Simpsons feels timeless, but part of that timelessness is because a lot of what the culture The Simpsons was skewering hasn't really gone anywhere. Culture wars are long wars. Mr. Burns and his antagonistic, literal cartoonish villainy, or his contempt for his workers, is a more timeless skewering of, say, Elon Musk than The Simpsons' rendering of Elon Musk.
Dad, no! Elon Musk is possibly the greatest living inventor!
Hey, do you remember when The Simpsons made an episode about a con man selling a monorail? Shows like Bob's Burgers, which in my opinion have aged into their later seasons more gracefully than The Simpsons did, owes a lot to the fact it's not jumping the shark and largely retaining its sense of being about a working class seafront community and the working class burger restaurant run by a family that loves and accepts each other. But even if I'm not fully convinced by the culture shift argument, the idea that Series 8 or The Principal and the Pauper were canaries in the coal mine are even less persuasive. Sure, Principal and the Pauper is not the best episode, not by a long way. Especially when compared to Sweet Seymour Skinner's badass song, I can understand why it would bother people so much. But I don't put much stock in the Principal and the Pauper being a harbinger of things to come for a few reasons. First, The Simpsons has actually undergone 2 Flanderizations. Flanderization isn't necessarily a bad thing, and neither is writer churn. It gives the opportunity for a product to evolve away from its original intent in a good way. An example of this is the Red Alert series, which started out as a somewhat tongue-in-cheek but ultimately serious retro sci-fi. Writer's churn allowed the team to take the series in the incredibly bombastic and cheesy direction of Red Alert 2 and 3.
Space!
Prior to Series 4, The Simpsons maintained this kind of Aristotelian unity. Characters only did stuff that could happen in the real world. This anchored the main joke of the show, to mock the sitcoms it grew up around where the status quo is God. And for The Simpsons, status quo is reinforced prima facie by the fact it's animated, so characters don't age or change. One Fish, Two Fish, Blowfish, Bluefish is a good example of this realistic grounding being used to surprisingly dark comedic ends. Homer writes a bucket list after he learns he has 24 hours to live. But his bucket list isn't fulfilled. Marge doesn't wake him up early, so he starts the day late. The sweet moment where he reconciles with his dad takes a turn for the farcical when the final hours of his life end up being consumed by Abe Simpson, and he takes items off his bucket list basically out of social embarrassment. The show ends with Homer proclaiming he's gonna start living life to the fullest after his brush with death, and then we're hit with this brutal hard cut to him living exactly the same as he did before. Dear Princess Celestia, I didn't learn a thing. That's a My Little Pony reference. I thought that was something CGP Grey said that one time. Duffless is another example. Homer quits drinking for a month, and the episode ends with him reappraising his relationship to alcohol after being confronted with Barney and the other patrons of Moe's Bar. The next episode, he's regressed right back into his alcoholism. Series 4 onwards had the show explore the borders of possibility it had as a cartoon, and the elasticity characters were afforded as cartoons. This coincided with The Simpsons shedding some of its cynicism and disdain for the flyover towns of America and the Homers that lived there. The tension between Groening's inkling to jaded cynicism with the more cartoonish whimsy of Al Jean, Mike Reiss, and Conan O'Brien was resolved in Gene, Reese, and O'Brien's favor.
O'Brien, you stupid monkey!
This move to the cartoonish was more firmly cast by Oakley and Weinstein, pushing further out from the traditional bounds of the show. This is comorbid with Homer's evolution from just smart enough to know he's dumb and insecure about it to dim-witted but lovable dad who clumsily tries to do right by the people in his life, or Marge's evolution from moral guardian to no-nonsense everyman. Bart was originally conceptualized by Groening as a Dennis the Menace who was an actual menace rather than the Dennis the Menace he watched growing up, but the traits he inherited from Dennis the Menace evolved into his more brilliant but lazy traits we see in later series, which also aligned with him playing one half of the Bart-Homer comedy duo we see from Series 4 onwards. Ned Flanders existed as a good neighbor whose religion was a background aspect to his character in earlier episodes. He existed to contrast and in some ways shame The Simpsons.
Kids can be a trial sometimes.
All right, knock it off!
Knock what off, Simpson?
You've been rubbing my nose in it since I got here. Your family is better than my family. Your beer comes from farther away than my beer. You and your son like each other. Your wife's butt is higher than my wife's butt. You make me sick!
It's only in later series that he evolved into a caricature of the Christian right. The only person who stays reasonably consistent is the voice of reason writing staff's idealized conception of themselves, Lisa. Series 4 to 9 is the era of Simpsons that really chimes with people. It's the era where the show was able to temper its darker cynicism with a degree of whimsy and a sincere core. I don't think you can claim that Principal and the Pauper marked the downward trajectory of The Simpsons by decoupling it from reality and pushing it into absurdism, because The Simpsons was already well into absurdist territory by that point. By the time Principal and the Pauper aired, the show had already deconstructed and reconstructed its universe for the sake of a joke countless times over. To reiterate, one of the foundational jokes of the show is to skewer and make fun of the ways sitcoms would do this. Principal and the Pauper wasn't even the first time the show lampshaded this fact. In Homer Loves Flanders in Series 5, the episode ends with an abrupt snapback to the status quo of Homer hating Flanders. This is how the episode ends.
I don't get it, Lise. You said everything would be back to normal, but Homer and Flanders are still friends.
Yeah, maybe this means the end of our wacky adventures.
Guess what, everyone? My great-uncle Boris died and left us his old country house. There's only one catch. They say it's haunted. But I'm sure we can prove him wrong by spending the weekend there.
Hi, diddly-o, neighbor.
Get lost, Flanders.
It's also not the first time there have been abrupt endings to return the show back to said default. In Sweet Seymour Skinner's badass song, Skinner is reinstated because Flanders says a prayer.
Well, cockily-doodly-doo, little buddies. Let's thank the Lord for another beautiful school day.
Thank the Lord. Thank the Lord? That sounded like a prayer. A prayer. A prayer in a public school.
Speaking of Series 5, Homer went to fucking space. Bart Gets an Elephant is 2 episodes after that. The ending of You Only Move Twice has Hank Scorpio seize the eastern seaboard of the United States and Homer take ownership of the Denver Broncos. The Stonecutters are this ancient secret society that everyone in Springfield is a member of, controls the British crown, keeps the metric system down. Homer is their messiah by a birthmark that appears for 1 episode, disappears right after, and is never brought up again. That would probably have ramifications in a world that wasn't designed to be as malleable as The Simpsons, wouldn't it? Remember in Series 5 where Homer was in a parody Beatles musical quartet and won a Grammy? Remember when the literal Mary Poppins showed up and The Simpsons drove her to a mental breakdown?
Do you think we'll ever see her again?
I'm sure we will, honey. I'm sure we will.
Remember how Brother from Another Series dropped Sideshow Bob's raison d'etre of killing Bart just so they could do an extended Frasier parody, and how it's one of the best episodes of the Golden Age? Remember how they changed Mr. Burns' backstory from the descendant of an upper-crust industrialist to actually being a peasant boy who's adopted by a twisted, loveless billionaire, all so they can do a Citizen Kane parody? Within Golden Age Simpsons canon, when projected into the future, Bart is both a deadbeat a la Lisa's Wedding and Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court a la Itchy and Scratchy in the movie. And the writers have pinballed between both of these in later series. Homer lost his hair learning Marge was pregnant, a la And Maggie Makes 3, and he lost it as a human guinea pig for the military, a la Marge on the Lam. And speaking of, in Lisa's first word, a young Homer and Marge, along with baby Bart, were living in an apartment on the Lower East Side of Springfield, and it's after learning Marge was pregnant that they buy a house. But in And Maggie Makes 3, Marge and Homer were already living in the house when she announced she was pregnant with Bart, and incidentally already have pictures of Maggie up in their house. Boy, I hope someone got fired for that blunder. The family's home address is always changing. In the Stonecutters episode, the power plant is right next door to the Simpsons house, like literally right next door. Characters come and go spontaneously. And how come the Batman doesn't dance anymore? Well, you see, the actual issue with Principal and the Pauper is we're following a secondary character in the form of Principal Hey, who left this Hurricane Neddy episode line here? I'm not trying to be a pedant, but the basis of the argument in every think piece on the episode about how Principal and the Pauper was bad and a signifier for a wider decline rests on the premise that its crime was it hard broke from the show's status quo and continuity for the sake of an absurd premise that ended up not materially changing the world. The Dead Homer Society piece argues that the episode not only contradicts many things that have been shown about Principal Skinner in the past, but was an example of these stories becoming ever more outlandish and being resolved in abrupt ways. And yeah, it contradicts the Skinner-centric episode from Series 5, but the truth of it is, barring a few touchstones like Maud dying, Lisa's vegetarianism, Barney going in and out of sobriety, Edna and Seymour dating, or Patty coming out, spoilers, The Simpsons can't, and by design, wasn't meant to have a solid continuity. Even if we ignore the fact that the meta joke of the show is to skew a sitcom's religious adherence to the status quo, by virtue of the characters never aging or changing while time still marches forwards means The Simpsons has to be fast and loose with its timeline and character continuity. So what is Principal and the Pauper undermining, demolishing, and rebuilding that The Simpsons hadn't already undermined, demolished, and rebuilt countless times before, exactly? Hell, The Simpsons even calls this out in Homer's enemy.
You went into outer space. You.
Sure. You've never been? Would you like to see my Grammy Award?
No!
Depending on how you view this scene, they do it in Series 4 too.
Who is that firebrand, Smithers?
That's Homer Simpson, sir.
Simpson, eh? New man?
Actually, sir, he thwarted your campaign for governor. You ran over his son. He saved the plant from meltdown. His wife painted you in the nude.
Doesn't ring a bell.
To be fair to the Dead Homer Society essay, part of why Principal and the Pauper receive such hatred may be a side effect of, let's call it, selective memory. If you find the essay on Web Archive, they argue the show began to spin away from its roots with the large amounts of writer churn between Series 5 and 7, replacing the show's old hands along with the loss of Doris Grain and Phil Hartman. Their perspective is watching The Simpsons after decades of saccharine, cookie-cutter sitcoms, so the cynicism of The Simpsons came as a breath of fresh air. So from the perspective of the Dead Homer Society piece, the decline of The Simpsons began much earlier than Series 9. They leveled the first Zombie Simpsons episode as Marge Be Not Proud in Series Series 7, because they argue it falls back on the tired saccharine tropes used by sitcoms The Simpsons was satirizing. The author goes on to argue that Series 8 feels like the show is spinning out of control, with invincible Homer, ignoring the fact he fell down a fucking gorge in Series 2, and an over-reliance on hyperkinetic cartoonish tropes in lieu of a story, and that trend becomes most noticeable with Principal and the Pauper. But you can't make video essays about Marge Be Not Proud or Series 7 of The Simpsons being the beginning of the end, because the IMDb scores look like this. And I'm not even sure the statement that Marge Be Not Proud falls back on old sitcom tropes holds up either. Firstly, because it's not the first time The Simpsons has used those tropes. The Last Temptation of Homer falls back on them to reaffirm Homer and Marge's love. But also, it still subverts sitcom tropes for comedy. Not to dissect the way scenes work, but in a run-of-the-mill sitcom, Marge would have gotten Bart Bonestorm. It would have been a way to signal her willingness to give Bart some leeway as he grows older and the boundaries of their relationship change. The reason the scene is so funny is because it plays like this.
You got me!
You won't see video essays about Series 8 of The Simpsons being the beginning of the decline either, partly because the boundaries of the show being a cartoon were being explored much earlier than Series 8, the writers and showrunners were just taking greater risks, and partly because those experimental risks gave us Hank Scorpio, and Homer's Phobia, and The Old Man and the Lisa, and Bart After Dark, and Citizen Kang, and The Twisted World of Marge Simpson, and The Springfield Files. I could go on. Accepting the premise that The Simpsons' strength was its aversion to sitcom tropes and its commitment to cynical realism would mean accepting the implicit view of the Dead Homer Society essay, the undercurrent of apprehension towards The Simpsons' emotional strengths born from the perspective of someone who grew up watching cookie-cutter sitcoms in the 70s and 80s. It's easier to defend the show by saying its brilliance is born from its borderline nihilistic outlook and its rigid rooting in realism, but it's not. An equal amount of strength came from the show's ability to create emotionally satisfying relationships and then undercutting them without necessarily falsifying the sentiment using whatever tools it had at its disposal. Sometimes this would be earnest.
But he's a loser. He's pathetic. He's a Simpson.
Other times it'd be a great joke.
Well, maybe I want to. But then I think about Marge and the kids. Well, not the boy. He drives me nuts. Sometimes I just like to...
It was the show's embrace of its emotional core and more cartoonish aspects that created the Golden Age Simpsons. If the shift from reality to absurdism that had been occurring for years by this point does represent a fatal misstep that compounded all the way to the critical mass of The Principal and the Pauper, then someone needed to tell The Simpsons. You want to return to Groening's deeply cynical, jaded anti-authoritarianism? Disenchanted's right over there, gathering dust. If you can't swallow the logic of the Dead Homer Society piece, it's easier to ignore the holistic argument of the piece and just point at Principal and the Pauper and say, yep, that's the problem, and nothing else. A counter-argument to this is to say the real issue is the show changed Skinner's backstory in a way that makes no sense for his character. But I don't think you can reasonably argue the episode undermined the integrity of the character either. The comedy of The Simpsons relies on strong characterization, where characters have clear lodestars for the ways they act and think, yeah. It is a weakness of modern Simpsons that their second Flanderization means characters are facsimiles of themselves or operate as blank slates, and yes, Principal and the Pauper did overwrite Skinner's past history, but Principal and the Pauper only works because Skinner's characterization retains its lodestar. Skinner remains the rigid authority, the embodiment of hierarchy and order and rules. The awkwardness between Skinner the punk and Skinner the principal creates great comedic juxtaposition.
Principal Skinner?
Up yours, children.
Putting him back in the skin of punk Armin Tanzarian revealed the truth that that wasn't who he was, and he hadn't been that person for a long time, which is illustrated through this dry, uptight delivery born of the same pitch-perfect characterization people claim the show had undone.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Capital City's nakedest ladies. They're not even wearing a smile. Nod suggestively.
The Principal and the Pauper still carries the hallmarks of the best pieces of the show. The jokes are clever and layered, they're well-timed, and they're well-executed.
You lied about his name.
His name doesn't matter. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet.
Not if you called them stench blossoms.
Or crapweeds.
I'd sure hate to get a dozen crapweeds for Valentine's Day. I'd rather have candy.
Not if they were called scumdrops.
And it doesn't ask you to stop caring about the characters either. It carries the bittersweet moments where Skinner and Agnes say goodbye. In fact, it's one of the few episodes that really humanized Agnes. We have this moment between Edna and Seymour.
No, please, I don't care what you've done. You're still a decent, honorable man.
That's the kind of talk that makes me want to marry you.
And we have this touching scene between Skinner and, Skinner.
You've led quite a life, Tamzarian.
It's your life. I just kept it warm for you. Oh, I nearly forgot. Your pocket watch. Mother's picture is still inside. Take good care of her.
I'll wind her every day.
And the show is still subversive. The other Skinner goes to great pains to point out he's a veteran. He has an expectation that he can cash in on these shared societal values that tell us to respect the troops, especially veterans. But instead, Skinner 2 is met by a deeply ungrateful Springfield that couldn't care less about him fighting in a war.
Your new principal would like to say a few words. Remember, you have to respect him. He's a war hero.
I have a semi-medium-sized platform now, so I consider it my patriotic duty to push back on this idea that Principal and the Pauper somehow set a precedent that The Simpsons would follow into its teens and 20s or is the worst episode of The Simpsons. It didn't, and it isn't. The episode is fine. People pick on Principal and the Pauper because it's an easy episode to point to as the definitive fall of The Simpsons. Like the episode is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the later series of the First World War. But no one writes think pieces about why another Simpsons clip show in Series 6 actually spelled the beginning of the end for The Simpsons, because ultimately this approach of isolating a single episode to dissect will be dissecting a blip in an otherwise stellar roster. The Simpsons' decline to its mid-teen plateau and beyond was far more gradual. My script editor, Sir Benjamin Shapiro, points out that one of the shows that have retained their edge is South Park, who made the bold choice to change up their format and go serialized. It was a risk, but apparently it paid off. I haven't watched South Park since I was maybe 17, so I can't confirm this, but given that Series 8, i.e. the best series of The Simpsons, was created from this desire to experiment with the show, lends credence to this observation. The newer episodes of The Simpsons that I find, if not good, at least interesting, like Pixelated and Afraid, were ones that made the risky decision to break from the show's formula. This is why I'm more keen on explanations that say The Simpsons was the victim of entropic decay. The Simpsons' downfall is a byproduct of systemic changes, shifts in culture and society that end up marooning a show whose foundational joke was predicated on critiquing a status quo of an era that doesn't exist anymore. The inevitability of any show that becomes popular and zeitgeisty when it's countercultural losing that source when the cutting edge it was on moves, yet the show remains the same. The passing of the baton to writers who grew up watching the show, now writing for it, has created this risk-averse institution where the person in charge has the option to simply leave when they get bored and hand the reins to someone else instead of changing the show in order to resolve their boredom, a la Archer continually rebooting the universe post-Series 4. That risk aversion means writers play it safe, putting their own interpretations of what they believe the show is onto the screen, recycling ideas the show had already done.
But we already did it. It took 7 hours, but we did it. It's done.
Yes, but we've got to do it from different angles, again and again.
Shows just aren't meant to run for 30 plus years unless they make
loads of cash.
For me, I think the most concrete thing anyone can say is that The Simpsons went bad when it stopped being funny. Tune in for more insightful analysis. There's lots of different ways to be funny, and I'm sure I'll find one that works for me eventually. The Simpsons was really good at deploying different kinds of comedy, such as transgression of social norms, schadenfreude, and subversion of expectations.
See, I got this friend named Joey Jojo Jr. Shabadoo.
That's the worst name I ever heard.
Oh, no!
Hey, Joey Jojo!
But one The Simpsons was really good at, and really lent itself to, was farce. A great point in the book Comedy Rules from the Cambridge Footlights, the minds behind Yes Minister, argues farce is comedy at its purest. Farce doesn't mean idiotic, it doesn't mean random, it has to be built. And farce is built by establishing a baseline, a reasonable enough reality. You introduce something unusual, like a benign violation of an explicit or implicit social norm, or something that subverts your expectations. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Farce then comes from characters taking actions which have a rationale you can understand, either ones that are consistent with the person's worldview, or play into a shared sense of values. The logic of their actions are underpinned by values we recognize. It helps frame and justify the events on screen, which then spiral out of control towards an absurdist crescendo. Part of the strength of classic Simpsons was how good it was at escalation. The farce of classic Simpsons is carried by jokes which are tightly crafted and well executed, helped by the fact that the characters had solid characterization, which makes the logic of their actions come from recognizable values.
My family wants to move back to Springfield.
Let him go. You'll stay here with me. We'll go bowling.
If you want a good example of this, take this scene from the summer of 4'2".
This is the most thoughtful thing anybody ever...
Sweet, merciful crap! My car!
Everyone here is acting in ways we recognize and understand. Lisa's friends did a sweet gesture to show Lisa how much she means to them, and Lisa is moved by this gesture. Homer views it as an incredibly expensive act of vandalism. This is comedy derived from recognizable values and actions. It's also how The Simpsons would deliver its more biting commentary.
Mom, I know your intentions are good, but aren't the police a protective force that maintains the status quo for the wealthy elites? Don't you think we ought to attack the roots of social problems instead of jamming people into overcrowded prisons?
Look, Lisa. It's McGriff, the crime dog.
This type of comedy also means showing restraint. This is where The Simpsons' emotional strengths come into play. Classic Simpsons understood that when it gave you moments like Bart failing his test or Lisa's visible shame at her dad, it needs to tell you to take them seriously. You can't just understand, for example, Edna is upset at being stood up. You need to care for this moment to work. You need to be able to empathize with her. And Bart needs to understand he did a shitty thing. Modern Simpsons, by contrast, starts at 100 and stays there, which hampers its ability to create these moments of comedic tension and release. There is a reason to not be all jokes all the time. You don't need to maximize jokes. Case in point, in a new episode of The Simpsons, Homer's mom dies. When Bleeding Gums Murphy and Maude died, the jokes were balanced with actually treating their deaths and people's grief seriously. So you would think this would be handled like the heartbreaking thing it would be for Homer. But no. Homer's mom's ashes blow up a missile bunker. Mr. Burns is going to launch a missile of nuclear waste into the Amazon, and she's stopping him from beyond the grave. Ooh, ow, please, I'm begging you, just take it down a notch. Modern Simpsons feels a lot more improvisational. Now, improv is great. I used to be in an improv troupe. We've put on these free shows at local comedy clubs and then begged people for money at the end. I don't know, it felt kind of sleazy asking people to pay for a thing they could get for free and, hey look, my patron's on the screen. But improv tends towards inefficiency. A hallmark of how well The Simpsons was written was how well they set up and paid off jokes, and the efficiency they did it with. To take one of my favorite jokes from the episode The PTA Disbands as an example.
This Civil War cannon has been fully restored and is in ready-to-fire condition. But it's a good thing we're not firing it, because it happens to be aimed at the main support leg of that lookout tower. People don't realize that these cannons are very sensitive, and the slightest jolt could set them off. Of course, for safety reasons, we don't keep the cannon loaded.
This joke is well set up, and there's virtually no fat on it. One and done, as they say. I don't know who says that. Now compare this to one of the better jokes from A Serious Flanders Part 1, which a friend told me to watch as proof The Simpsons was getting good again. It's not. The main villain of the episode has just taken out Fat Tony and his mobsters in a shootout at Lard Lat Donuts.
What the? Stay in. You should have let me finish my parable!
Ahoy, hoy.
Why are you dipping my face in dough? Why are you kneading my face into an O shape? Why are you pushing my face toward the deep fryer?
Oh, I see. Clever. Madam.
Then Snake comes in to commit a robbery.
Hands up! This is totally... Oh God! My God! What the hell happened? Oh, Mafia guys! Headless dude! Oh, Disco Man! We need some water. Oh, his face is a donut! That is so messed up!
This joke is fine. It's got a decent setup to it, and Snake's reaction is both funny and congruent, but it's trying to do too much. The jokes it has are overly long and bloated. There's no subtlety here, no restraint. No, Al, you can't have more crusty brand imitation gruel. Tighten up your jokes. Play the shootout straight, cut out the bulk of Fat Tony's dialogue here, cut out the amount Snake was talking, and all you'd lose is several minutes of baggage.
What the...
Madam.
Hands up. This is totally... Oh, God! My God! What the hell happened? I need some water. Oh, his face is a donut! That is so messed up!
Anyway, I realize dissecting a comedy kills the comedy, but it has to be done so we have a framework to work with. How does declining standards in The Simpsons relate to Simpsons Hit and Run? Because from a purely nuts and bolts perspective, modern Simpsons prodigy The Simpsons game has a more layered and multifaceted story than Hit and Run. The story of Hit and Run only really gets going around level 3, and it's a pretty basic story. A bunch of WASP cameras and mysterious black fans start appearing all over Springfield at the same time a new cola is hitting the shelves. Bart is abducted by aliens at the end of level 2, and we find out that Kang and Koda supplied him with cola that makes people go mad in order to help the ratings of their Hidden Wasp camera TV show.
I'm going to introduce the evil cola into the water supply. People will go mad. I like it. Then we distribute laser guns at the Squidport tourist area. I like it. The cola-maddened humans will go berserk. I like it. Destroying themselves and their town.
Delivering big space ratings for foolish earthlings.
It ends with the cola raising the dead and Homer using nuclear waste to blow up their ship. As far as stories go, it's out there, but this is where it's also important to remember that what matters is the vibe the game creates. Sorry if you forgot that was a while ago. What makes Simpsons Hit and Run succeed over the Simpsons game is that it's closer to the golden age era of the Simpsons, so it understands how to build fast and understands how to use the characters of the Simpsons in service of that. The Simpsons game inherits a lot from modern Simpsons, so it's a lot more gimmick-oriented out the gate, and since its central premise is to parody other video games, it only becomes more gimmicky with time, with its constant referencing and the way the game will just shift to different game modes. But the game story itself starts, if not at 100, then maybe 60, so there isn't a lot of headroom for escalation, meaning the game has to retain a certain level of breathless zaniness. Despite being an absurd premise, Simpsons Hit and Run gives its story and jokes space to breathe by introducing the inciting incident a few levels down the line, and it tips its hand in subtle ways. I like the surprisingly dark comedic tone of the environmental storytelling of Hit and Run. I like how the intro paper for level 5 is downplaying the Buzz Cola conspiracy. I like how they use a photo of Marge giving birth to paint her as a crank, and how Homer didn't think to give the paper a better picture. I love how Apu's level has billboards that says Buzz Cola for humans after learning Buzz Cola is being used by aliens. I love how at the end of level 5, where you learn that the aliens are using Buzz Cola to send Springfield into a rampage, player characters develop more of a sense of urgency, but the town has seemingly embraced Buzz Cola harder. Squidport's full of all the Buzz Cola balloons and the banners for the Colabration. I love how the water in this level has turned reddish-brown because Buzz Cola is just being dumped into the ocean. It's simultaneously really brazen and a detail that's not called attention to. I love how, since the plot of the game is basically an extended Treehouse of Horror, someone had the idea of having the last level take place on Halloween. I love the little quips pedestrians give when you hit them, and I love the world as a mix of random background characters and people you'd recognize, as opposed to a hub world filled only with characters you'd recognize, and getting Mole Man to say that funny line like he did that one time.
Well, you're certainly doing your job today, Mr. Sun.
Actually, on the subject of the hub world in the Simpsons game, it's weirdly lifeless. There's no music, no cars driving around. The world feels ghostly. And minor gripe, I know there's no continuity to locations in The Simpsons, but The Simpsons game does personally bother me with its very clear disregard for geography. Like, why is Nelson's shack here? Compare and contrast with Hit and Run, where there was a clear effort to make the levels themselves feel like Springfield. Simpsons Hit and Run put a lot of time into making Springfield feel like a cohesive city. There's very clear zoning, which also plays into a joke from A Tale of Two Springfields, where Springfield is divided between its phone area codes. They even keep fidelity to that episode by having the power plant in the 636 area code, the mansions in the 939 area code, and the riverbed full of gold separating the two. The introduction of traffic and pedestrians is a great way for the game to inject a lot of organic comedy. The almost cartoonish way the world reacts to you is fun, and it's fun to kill time exploring the sandbox of Springfield. It's never not funny that the police chasing you will ram you on foot and send you spinning out, or how the tutorial cutting into a hit and run inadvertently made it a JoJo meme. The game also uses music to help inject a distinct feeling into each area. I love the Duff Brewery playing the Duff Beer for Me song. I love how the music shifts to this sleazy vibe when driving around Moe's Bar and the Legitimate Business Club. Yeah, not for nothing, the music in this game fucking slaps. Following missions have a covert, sneaky, almost noir-esque feeling to them that gives the missions a sense of mystery. I love the Metallica-esque metal for Snake's missions in level 6 or Operation Hellfish in level 3. A lot of the music has this fast-paced tempo to help mirror and elevate the frantic pacing to a lot of the missions. I love how it uses the saxophone to give it a show feel. Saying this will probably get me cancelled, but Apu's mission music is a string of non-stop bops, and Office Space goes hard. The focus on level geography let Radical inject cute references from the show into the game in other ways. I like how the references to the show are peppered in the world and not just made immediately obvious, they just exist as treats for Simpsons fans. I love the solid gold house and the rocket car reference to the episode The Day the Violence Died. I love the fact someone said, hey, we should let the player drive the rocket car. I love how all the levels have a hidden car in them that you can find and drive. I love that the monorail is in disrepair and that is drivable. I love how the Sea Spanker is actually a secret Globex ship. I love that on the ship you can find Nightboat, the crime-solving boat. That's what the boat is, by the way. Like, no one seems to know what the boat is called. I like how they remembered the Quickie Mart has a secret rooftop garden from Lisa the Vegetarian. I love the inclusion of the escalator to nowhere and the matchstick skyscraper. I love the continuity from Marge versus the monorail where the giant magnifying glass burns it down, and in between levels 2 and 5, it actually burnt down. It's cute. I love the quirks of each vehicle and how they say something about their respective owners. I love how Snake's car has a body in the back or how Homer has cans of Duff in his. And the game is just funny.
Sir, this folder is empty. To rob me is one thing, but I never expected you to lie.
As mentioned, a big strength of Hit and Run is in its characterization and joke delivery. I love how quotable the game is.
These miniature cameras are an outrage. Spying on our women's dressing rooms, bathrooms, and locker rooms is unforgivable. I think I speak for all Springfielders when I say, where is the sexy footage?
Krusty and the pieces of the story involving him are by far the best example of the game using characterization to sell the escalation of the game's events in a really funny way. The opening, where Buzz Cola is introduced, is done in the same way as Krusty-O's.
New and improved Buzz Cola is made from only the finest sugars and waters. Plus, it has a special ingredient, too hot for the FDA.
It captures Krusty as a cynical, shameless shill who blindly lends his seal of approval to any branded product, no matter how shoddy and life-endangering it might be, so long as there's a paycheck at the end of it. And when Bart proves to Krusty that laser guns are real, Krusty gives a response befitting his character. He doesn't care.
You've taught this old clown a lesson. Blah, 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 etc., stay in school. I just wish you told me before I let them set up those free laser gun stands.
It's such a Krusty thing to do. This is a great example of farce. Everyone here is acting with a consistent logic in the spirit of their character, and it's all building towards the game's crescendo. This is something the Simpsons game just didn't understand. Part of this is due to the second Flanderization the Simpsons underwent as the game of telephone the writers were playing with older Simpsons intensified. Not only does it make the characters less likable and more one note.
Now cracks our noble heart. Good night, sweet Simpsons, and flights of aliens, sing thee to thy rest.
It also creates plot as contrivance. I think I really hated playing this game when I was younger was this moment here.
Well, it says that we need to find...
Move it! I want to play solitaire.
It's a good example of how Homer's more in-your-face humanity has been replaced with a cruel and obnoxious void of impulse control. But this isn't farce born from a recognizable logic in Homer's choices. This is a contrivance to forward the plot. It's not a clever joke. The Simpsons game doesn't have anything as subtle as a gag in a loading screen which gives the story flavor. There's Simpsons spirit and you get it, we've gone over that. Characterization also extends into the music. Homer's musical stings use tubas and trombones to create this plodding sound to complement Homer's oafishness and buffoonish personality.
I'm a lean, mean speed thingy.
Bart's music has this rocky punk edge to reflect his bad boy persona.
I feel broken inside.
Lisa's music leans heavily on the saxophone and has this jazzy, upbeat feeling to it to reflect her interest in music and the arts. And Marge's music The game just oozes charm. I know that's a thing game reviewers say to gussy up their reviews, but it really does, and it's that charm that makes it memorable. The Simpsons game has meta-commentary about how all old games eventually become obsolete and forgotten, but I've thought a lot more about Simpsons Hit and Run than the Simpsons game. And given the strength of public opinion on Hit and Run, everyone else did too. More importantly though, my memories of Hit and Run are a lot fonder. Good game design, or interesting and weird design choices, or games that have a lot to say for themselves, or even just games that have a lot of heart and soul are timeless. All these games are, to various extents, cash grabs. But no one's favourite Simpsons game is The Simpsons game, because at its core, it's like modern Simpsons, soulless and uninspired, a grey sludge churned out by a deeply cynical machine whose only purpose is to squeeze ideas until there's nothing left to squeeze. The fact the game understands what it is doesn't change that reality. And with EA's Simpsons Tapped Out being a gambling microtransaction hellscape that's the only Simpsons game in town right now, and quite possibly blocking the development of other Simpsons games, it's good to remember the one Simpsons game that doesn't feel cynical. The team that made Hit and Run clearly adored The Simpsons, and regardless of anything else I say, the one thing you can never call Hit and Run is soulless. Anyway, now to explain how the game is bad! The air of Hit and Run is clean, but it's getting polluted by all this traffic. Jesus, really laboured that, didn't I? The far more substantive part of Hit and Run is the driving gameplay. Quick question to contemplate in your own time. How much can you do in a car? Okay, that's enough time. There's not that much, so how do you keep players engaged? Grand Theft Auto does it by having a varied set of gameplay. You're not just autoing, you're also thefting. Fuck, my ex was right. Simpsons Hit and Run can't really have you grandly theft and auto, and for reasons we'll get into later, this game wouldn't be fun if it utilised more of its on-foot aspects, so the game has to rely on its driving. But as mentioned, there's only so much you can do with missions based around cars. Destroy a vehicle, follow a vehicle, race someone, evade someone, collect things in your car, collect things that fall from a car, and smash into someone's bumper to force things out of them. The limitations of this structure means Hit and Run recycles these missions for the entire game with little in the way of expansion. This creates a problem. If the structure of your game is basic and repetitive, how do you keep your gameplay loop fun? The solution the developers at Radical came up with was to scale the difficulty of the game with each level. Which, difficulty is a really difficult... You do this every time! There is a diverse set of ways games can approach difficulty. Fallout New Vegas, to make a completely original observation, uses difficulty in two ways. Firstly, by blocking off two of the more direct routes to New Vegas with Deathclaws and Cazadors, it forces the player to go south, learn more about Benny, meet some of the minor factions in the region, and meet the NCR and the Legion. You get to learn about the growing power struggle and issues the NCR faces in pacifying the region. It gives the world and story texture. And secondly, it doesn't actually force you to go south and round. You can technically go through these areas, Victor, no! Or you can come back to these places when you've leveled up and gained some experience, bask in the glow of a job well done, and feel a tangible sense of growth and development. See also another game series with a really great approach to difficulty. Dead Rising. You thought I was going to say one of the Souls games, didn't you? Is that because I put up footage of a Souls game? Ha! What a rube you were to fall for my bait and switch. Dead Rising, and to a lesser degree Dead Rising 2, and to an even lesser degree Dead Rising 2 off the record, work by having the player make progress, die, lose that progress, and have the player try again with more knowledge about weapons you can find or craft, more knowledge about what event triggers there are, and hopefully a higher level to make getting around the world easier. The games don't label boss fights, for example, so if you wandered into a boss fight and got murked, when you'd come back you'd learn not to do that event until you were stronger. What made the first two Dead Rising games really tick was the timer. Clever. The open world is very freeing. There's nothing stopping you from letting your daughter turn into a zombie, or letting yourself be framed for causing the outbreak, or just killing zombies till the army shows up. But the timer adds pressure to the choices you make. For example, you can misjudge how much time you have and fail a time-sensitive case that's critical to progressing the story. Do you carry on in the doomed world you've created and take your knowledge and higher level into a fresh game when you fail? Or do you send yourself back however many hours at a lower level without that knowledge to try again? Do you forgo saving people because your daughter Katie needs Umbrex? Do you prioritize story missions over saving people, even though that means giving up one of the best ways to earn PP? PP. And saving people had its own time-based strategies. People would become savable at certain times, and you'd have a window of time to save them in. As your knowledge of the map grows, you can start prioritizing how you save people, like gathering multiple survivors at once, for example. But larger groups can be difficult to control, and they can be vulnerable to zombies, especially when you save two people who need carrying at the same time. This is a terrible idea. Why did I do this? The timer created a lot of give and take between what you prioritize to make progress without dying and how you interacted with the world. Another way the game did this was by having you physically save by going to the toilet. Aggressive players save less because it takes time and can force you to go out of your way to do it. That's time you don't have to spare that you could invest in other things. But the choices to save less has a real trade-off. For example, when the rednecks take over the strip in Dead Rising 2 and make it dangerous to pass, you don't have to take them out. You can decide to navigate through the malls and casinos instead. This is safer, but more time-consuming. The more time-efficient route of going directly across the plaza is also the more dangerous one. You made a choice to escort survivors through the mall, and that might mean you couldn't save as many people. You can take them out, but if you die, your last save could be a good few hours back. You made the choice to forego saving, and that had a real material cost to the way that you play. And that also makes saving risky in a way, because it becomes possible to softlock yourself. Then Dead Rising 3 made time pass really slowly, and it autosaved. And it didn't make you craft items in a physical location out of specific items, and you can't craft things without blueprints, so the experience of making combo weapons is a lot less organic. I really wanted to like Dead Rising 3. I mean, I don't hate Dead Rising 3, but I don't love it. Play Dead Rising 3 on Nightmare mode. It makes you save in a physical space and reduces the amount of time you have. Anyway, the point of this segue is that early Dead Rising games had a philosophy of you are in control and it's your fault. Remember that, it's going to come up later. Most games, however, approach the concept of difficulty by applying difficulty scaling, where things scale up procedurally to match a player's skill level. This is a really smart way to approach difficulty. As Deus Ex's lead designer Warren Spector said,
this is genius right here. As the player gets better, make the game harder.
The first few levels of a game essentially function as a tutorial, as well as easing the player into the story. Then the game scales up in difficulty with each level, increasing the challenge to match the player's skill and experience. As you get better armor or weapons, enemies you fight have more health, or you encounter a diverse range of enemies with different approaches and tactics. Balance this right, and in theory, you get a game which feels fair, where it's always entertaining because it isn't too easy or too hard. A game that does this really well is Black Mesa / Half-Life. As your arsenal grows and you gain access to pieces of gear like the long jump module, the number of enemies and nature of combat encounters grow and diversify to be broadly on par with the player's expected ability at that point. You go from easy to avoid barnacles, to slow shooting Vortigauns, to agile, intelligent soldiers, to soldiers with tanks, to beefy alien grunts, and it all arcs seamlessly upwards. It's challenging without being obnoxious. Dead Rising and Dead Rising 2 does this with the countdown to when the helicopter or military arrive. In Dead Rising, the arrival of special forces introduces highly trained and heavily armed soldiers, which meant getting abducted a lot in overtime mode. Dead Rising 2 introduces gas zombies, which are faster, harder to kill, and more aggressive. Difficulty scaling is standard practice for games, and don't just take my word for it. A study reveals 90% of games start with easy tutorial level. Simpsons Hit and Run uses the first two levels to introduce its various mechanics and mission formats. You've got your races, your time trials, your collect item missions, your platforming missions, your following missions, your murdering your manager missions. And because these are tutorial levels, they'll impart knowledge to the player. If you need to destroy stuff, for example, it's in your interest to get a big, tough vehicle that can dish out damage and take it too. The tutorial missions essentially work to show the game in microcosm. For example, you're collecting items you've stolen from Flanders, and the way they lay that out is fairly smart. You learn that the bread and butter of missions is going to be driving fast against the clock and involves some light platforming. And items are placed in front of shortcuts to telegraph to you, hey, levels are built with shortcuts, so keep an eye out for them. Other things the game needs to teach you will come about organically. I don't know what this says about 8-year-old me, but one of the first things I did when I started this game was assault my wife. Push that far enough and you'll trigger a hit and run, where the Springfield Police Department will assault your wife for you and then fine you 50 coins for the privilege. So maybe don't kick too many Jesus. You get coins from senseless acts of cartoon violence. No, not that kind. Buzz Cola is a central part of the story, and as part of the world you find crates and vending machines you can smash up to pay off your police debts. But these also fill up your hit and run meter. meter, so if you don't want to be broke, maybe keep an eye on this while getting these. You fill the meter driving recklessly as well, so learn to drive, dumbass. Finally, none of the cars available in early levels are especially hard to drive. They're slow to accelerate and have a lot of grip. It's a way to ease you into the driving mechanics and let you learn how they all work just by naturally driving around the world. And then, in line with an upwards difficulty curve, the base missions which make up the game get harder, and the vehicles you get access to require more skill to use. Simple enough formula, right? Right. Now, cast your mind back to when I said the words in theory, because in practice, the balance of difficulty scaling is hard to pin down. More often than not, games either become far too easy, stripping what little challenge and thus fun there was from the game, or become exercises in Sisyphean tedium where you have to push a boulder up a hill only to have it barrel down the other side as a big old ball of fuck you into the orphanage of your hopes and dreams. So Fallout 3, to pick another totally original example, basically has you as king of the wasteland by level 5, and all the challenge or sense of growth you might otherwise have exits the experience. Or if you try to do dead money without the appropriate skill levels and perks, you get to eat shit. Simpsons Hit and Run has an extra special dimension complicating this relationship to difficulty. An observation I had for the longest time that only really came into focus revisiting this is how a lot of games I remember from childhood were hard, and how they've retained their hardness with age. My suspicion is that this difficulty is a vestigial property of gaming when it was in its infancy, and design still had old arcade machines in mind, where the games make money for an operator by collecting coins. The best designed game from this perspective will be one that gets the players to pay in, and doesn't push them to quit. The challenge of gameplay, the aesthetic experience, and the payoff for progress will all link into how long these games can keep you paying in. Length of time playing isn't the goal per se, but it does dovetail nicely with the goal of revenue. These days, games increase revenue through microtransactions and getting kids to gamble. Which brings us to today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. Please stop contacting me. With the transition to home consoles, it's easy to see how games would evolve to treat time as the main quantifiable goal of a successful game for the sales end. Here's a fact not a lot of people know. Consoles and games are expensive. I didn't buy Simpsons Hit and Run. Simpsons Hit and Run came with a handful of other games when my parents bought the PS2. I feel like I should clarify with this joke. My parents are happily married. Like, I had a good childhood. We were just poor. Like, perhaps you were Billy Bob McBigbollocks living at large in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield and could get all the fancy games when they came out. But the rest of us proles had to make do. I didn't get new games regularly, and people I know didn't either. So games needed to last a while for my parents to feel like the games they bought were good value for money. Designers, keenly aware of how a game being short could negatively impact it in reviews, and operating on the expectation that most gamers would be kids without disposable income, would therefore look for ways to extend playtime. Making more content requires more work, so a workaround is getting the most gameplay out of the smallest amount of game.
There's very little
gameplay
in these
games. I couldn't substantiate this theory of difficulty inflation for the longest time, so I was going to leave this as just a theory. A game theory. But then when I was researching, I came across Nerdstalgic Gaming's interview with Kerry Brisebois, lead programmer of Simpsons Hit and Run, who essentially confirmed this suspicion.
A lot of the time when you're trying to sell a game to an audience at retail, so it's a bit different I think than digital, but you're selling is not only the license experience with The Simpsons, but and this game is going to be 30 plus hours, right? At the time, there was a very stiff competition for the games to not be short. Like if you bought a game, I think Sands of Time at the time was sort of criticized for being too short, right? So I think it would affect your Metacritic rating, right? Because Eurogamer would say, yeah, the game's fun, but it was only 4 hours long, and I paid $60 for it. But I'm going to give it 6 out of 10. So that kind of thing is really, really on everybody's mind. In order to make this game be, not just a really good Simpsons experience, but also something that you would spend a long time playing, because then you could claim it's like a 20 or 30 hour experience. The later missions in the game start being a lot more grindy, intentionally, so that we can make those kinds of claims so that people don't go and review this and say, oh yeah, I finished it in an hour or whatever, right? So it's entirely intentional. And yeah. there's that side, right? Like you see, like those final missions are like brutally impossible. And a lot of that is because we're like, yeah, we don't want people necessarily finishing the game right away, so we're going to make these really hard. And if you really want to win it, you're going to have to try.
This business logic means Simpsons Hit and Run has a janky and uneven difficulty curve. And I know this because if you look at the game's leaked documentation, you can plot a graph of the perceived difficulty rating from the literal 3 guys who playtested the game, and it looks like this. I make a lot of graphs. As a result, many of the areas the designers tripped up feel like the result of trying to extend playtime, rather than thinking about how difficulty tweaks would translate into gameplay. This sort of difficulty curve is antithetical to good design philosophy. Unless your goal is to defeat the player, which, to be clear, kinda was the goal for the Radical team, your curve shouldn't have huge spikes and troughs like this. Okay, I wanted to clarify on this because listening back, it's not super clear what I mean here. So the issue is not the sine curve-esque shape to the difficulty curve. It can be really good design to make your game's difficulty curve essentially look like a saw blade, because as opposed to, say, a straight line, it stops the increase in challenge becoming predictable and create these really nice moments of tension and release, which Hit and Run does very well, and we'll get into that a bit later on. The issue is that the game has these quite large swings between their peaks, and it has a really sharp spike around level 5, and this spike, again, exists by design. It's meant to slow your progress down and artificially frustrate you, and that's the issue. Okay, let's start constructive. An area of the difficulty scaling really works to produce a fun, satisfying experience are the optional racing missions. And exploring why means we have to go on a physics detour, which also means going on a road rage detour. Put on your seatbelts, kids. I don't want another Diana on my conscience. A lot of people compare Hit and Run to GTA 3 because you can, get chased by the police. In the Hit and Run design documents, the team at Radical took a lot of inspiration from the way vehicles handled in GTA 3 when building their driving game. A less talked about aspect of Hit and Run is also the fact it's a spiritual successor to Simpsons Road Rage. In the dev files, they even sometimes refer to the game as SRR2, or Road Rage 2. Simpsons Road Rage is trying to pull off the same trick as the arcade game Crazy Taxi, but it lacks the features that made the gameplay loop in Crazy Taxi compelling. Road Rage doesn't reward you for weaving through traffic, pulling off jumps, or causing near misses, which was one of the more absorbing parts of developing your Crazy Taxi skills. But Road Rage's main crime is that the physics engine spits into Isaac Newton's little mouth. Traffic will rebound your vehicle depending on how the game felt that day. Usually if you hit a car, you slow down and get knocked back like bumper cars, making vehicles stick to each other in a really unreactive way, but you can also collide into a vehicle and the car you hit will do the equivalent of ragdoll physics where you just speed away or end up locked in a game of pinball with Jesus. And there's almost no way to intuit which one you're going to end up doing, because the way your car responds to the environment is incredibly hard to read. Like, I can barely read a picture book. You're in God's hands now. This impacts other hazards in the game. The atomic buses should add a layer of unpredictability to the world, because they'll chase you down and collide with you and other traffic to generate obstacles. So the theoretical havoc that atomic buses can create means you have to weigh up the payoff of a faster time versus the risk of time lost if you get yeeted across the map. In reality though, they just don't. They don't destabilize your car in a way the player would need to adapt to. Level geometry is also janky. You can clip parts of the road or pavement and have you careen in God knows what direction. And then there's how vehicles in Road Rage actually feel to drive, which is like water snakes. Different cars control uniquely and have varied attributes with regards to speed and stability, and learning and mastering each vehicle's unique quirks is rewarding, but the game's relationship to its controls and mechanics is decidedly shallow. In Crazy Taxi, comboing brake reverse was an optimization mechanic. Road Rage also lets you combo brake and reverse, but comboing these buttons isn't a suggestion, it's a rule. Cars retain momentum really well in Road Rage, giving them weird, long deceleration curves, so a brake reverse combo is really the only way to stop. The game also allows you to pull off maneuvers like J-turns and donuts by holding down brake while you accelerate and turn. This spins the car around a central axis, making your turnaround time really fast, because your turning circle is essentially 0. When you brake in Road Rage, steering left or right locks the rear wheels and produces a near-instant 90-degree rotation. And since cars hold their momentum in Road Rage, while it makes cars responsive, it doesn't allow for more expressive kinds of driving play. You can't really do things like peel-outs or power sliding. There's not a lot in Road Rage which allows you to demonstrate your skills at driving. So you have a game system that mandates fast and reckless driving, but only sometimes, with a vehicle set and world which isn't geared for fast and reckless driving, or for letting the player express their true mastery of a vehicle through fast and reckless driving. You can see how this would cause problems. These weaknesses were something Radical Entertainment noticed as well.
The first driving, like Road Rage driving, is pretty rough, man. I don't ever fire that up.
They felt that while the driving mechanics in Road Rage were good, they wanted Hit and Run's physics to mirror GTA 3's to create a certain kind of game feel. In particular, they wanted their cars to go into understeer and drift if you took a corner too fast rather than spin out. And they wanted to recreate effects like fishtailing, where the rear car wheels lose traction and skid, requiring players to apply opposite lock and throttle modulation to bring the vehicle back under control. The task to implement this new driving system fell to Greg Mayer, who must have tremendous back pain from carrying the entire game's physics system.
Greg, what was your first memory of working on the Simpsons projects here?
It was writing the driving prototype. Vlad was putting the team together, and we had a guy making a physics library internally because at the time, middleware physics was not even widely available. So he was building the physics library, and then I went to the producer putting the team together, and I said, hey, I have an idea of how to use this guy's physics library to create some fun driving. I remember actually reading articles in Game Developer magazine, like the print magazine, by Chris Hecker, and I got to see Chris Hecker at GDC some years later, and he was discussing, ways of approaching vehicle physics and stuff, and I'm like, this is really cool. So I took his kind of some of the concepts he was putting forth there, and I took the middleware physics.
We've been talking for a while now. I think we've gotten to know each other, so I feel like I can open up to you about my secret fetish for emergent complexity in games. Games like Friday the 13th, or XCOM Enemy Unknown, or how Hearts of Iron 4 lets you pull an Order 66. You might call this an exploit, but I call this a brilliant exploit. I love games where you can get really complex, deep, nuanced types of play from a few simple rule sets and controls, or even just hilarious emergent properties. Weird things in the code aside, like all the functionality for retrieving gravity modifiers in the vehicle physics, which I then never used, or the quirk Ordolaro 5 points out, where the baby van in mission 8 is too much has a 50-50 chance of spawning with its center of mass in the wrong place, making it swerve violently out of control, or the fact that the physics is dictated by the frame rate the game is running at, so if you run the game without a frame rate limiter, the cars turn into pinballs. When the physics engine isn't busy glitching out, Simpsons Hit and Run's driving system has a surprising amount of emergent complexity from its rule set and controller inputs, which is probably why the game has such an active speedrunning community. There's lots of fun ways you can exploit the game's physics and emergent properties to get better times. This emergent complexity in the driving physics has a lot to do with the more nuanced physics Hit and Run has compared to Road Rage. Now, this is where you'd watch a cool, smart physics man explain driving physics, except they're on the Gabbo show now. So, here's Eastern Europe's favorite driving physics explaining team, Circle of Forces! The way Hit and Run codifies their circle of forces is by looping through all four wheels on a vehicle and then applying various types of forces to them, such as acceleration, brake force, reverse force, emergency brake effect, and steering. It then looks at what terrain the vehicle is on and applies a scaling factor to the total force to simulate terrain friction. Roads offer you the most friction and therefore grip. Surfaces like grass and dirt, though, offer less traction. If a wheel is touching grass, which is generally encouraged, the total force is multiplied by 0.7, making the wheel less grippy. In the code, the variable desired lateral resistance force is used to calculate the total amount of force that should be applied to the vehicle to resist its motion sideways based on certain conditions, such as the vehicle's speed, brake, and gas inputs, the vehicle's mass, and the type of terrain it's on. The final value of desired lateral resistance force is then used to apply the necessary force to the vehicle in order to resist its lateral motion and maintain a stable trajectory. When you're turning at high speeds with the pedal to the metal, the amount of lateral resistance force applied to the vehicle is reduced based on how much the car is accelerating, which causes the vehicle to lose traction and slip. Steering hard into a corner while going fast will make most vehicles lose traction and either drift or fishtail, requiring you to countersteer. Turning a car while maintaining control is a lot harder at high speed. If you're braking into the corners at high speeds, it increases the amount of lateral resistance to help you maintain stability in corners. Because e-braking increases the amount you skid and raises your lateral resistance in turns, you can use e-braking to go through corners faster and take tighter lines through them. The weight component to the desired lateral velocity also creates differences between cars. So the big heavy school bus with its high mass means it's less likely to spin out than, say, the honor roller. The sedans of the early game are slow, fairly responsive, and easy to drive, Larger vehicles are heavy, lumbering, and unresponsive, but have a huge mass advantage, meaning you're less likely to lose control of them. More generally, the code makes vehicles less stable when you're gunning it. At high speeds, the traction provided by the wheels is lowered, making high speeds more unforgiving from a handling perspective and creating instability. If a vehicle is in a slip state, it engages the skid level based on the projection of the vehicle's velocity perpendicular to the direction of travel. Faster cars will have more skidding when they enter a slip state. If you're entering a slip state with the e-brake on, the game will run a check and increase the skid level if the e-brake is on and greater than half the friction created by e-braking. Your vehicle will skid more when the brakes apply. If that sounded obvious to you, good. It should. That means the physics makes sense now, and it means Hit and Run's reactions to your actions are a lot more intuitive. By having better codified steering and friction, Simpsons Hit and Run introduces new kinds of vehicle behavior.
One of the big changes between those two, John, was the
Weeble.
I put a lot more. I think Road Rage had the Weeble. I'm curious anybody watching this video will know what the hell a Weeble is. But in Hit and Run, I put a lot more attention to the idea that a tire, especially like picture a rear wheel drive sports car, and you're accelerating, you're not going to have as much lateral resistance while you're using those wheels to drive forward. So if you do a turn, you're going to the back end of the car is going to spin out. And it'll be vice versa for front wheel drive. And when I incorporated that effect, I remember discussing with Travis actually, and then when I added that, and then you drive around and your back end would start to slide out, that was like a whole new world open up there.
When your vehicle speed is less than a certain percentage of its top speed, and the gas input from the controller is above a certain threshold, the car will enter a burnout state. In this state, the force magnitude of the drive wheels is decreased by multiplying it by a gas decrease value. Depending on which direction the wheels are pointing, and depending on how much steering angle the wheel is, the physics will apply additional torque to the wheel. It means you'll do a donut! Simpsons Hit and Run will use the same check to create a speed boost effect. If you hold down the brake for a certain amount of time, and then while holding down the brake and pressing down the throttle, release the brake, you'll do something called a peel out, where you get an acceleration boost, and the camera does this cool pin back. When a vehicle is reversing and the steering input is greater than a certain threshold, the code sets a flag indicating that a Rockford is happening, and it reduces the resistance to lateral forces acting on the rear wheels before applying a torque on the wheels to make the car spin. If you're reversing and turning, the game will crank down the lateral resistance force to make the turn more responsive. It means J-turns are good now! The controls never get more complicated than accelerate, reverse, brake, and steer. They are simple enough for players just starting out, but as an emergent behavior of the physics, Hit and Run allows for more nuanced expressions of player skill. The reward for high-speed performances has to be earned with knowing how to control vehicles, how to correct things like understeer, and understanding at least a little bit about how the physics works. Sorry, I know I'm spending a lot of time on the game physics, but it's important to understand a lot of the other praises and gripes I have. This game's problems are multitudinous, and they all fit together in weird ways. Everyone and their mom has a shallow 7-minute review of the game you can go watch if this bothers you. You come to me for the weird erudite shit that doesn't go anywhere. What does this have to do with difficulty in racing? Right, so there's an incentive to do racing missions beyond mere completionism. You often get a really good vehicle out of them that can make it easier to do missions that advance the plot. But winning races requires players to learn and intuit how cars balance speed, acceleration, and handling, and plan what car would work best for which race. Often, you race against the main car for the next level. Because of the way the game assigns vehicles to you, the next level cars are faster than anything you can have access to, which means in a straight race, you're fucked. But the designers clearly built races with the physics actually working in mind. A byproduct of fixing the physics engine is that you can actually utilize drift to correct for fast driving, using it to cut corners or take a tighter inside line. This corrected physics also introduces risks like potentially overbraking or colliding with something too hard and spinning out if you fail to properly execute a maneuver. But now there's an appropriate mechanical compensation. Since you can do J-turns to create a sharper turning circle, you can utilize it to get back in the fight faster. There's a real risk-reward dynamic of getting into first place by cutting corners and going faster than you should, while risking making a small gap larger. You know your lead is fragile. Do you do the risky maneuver that could cost you, but make your lead more secure if it works? Or if you're in close second, the risky corner cut could be the difference between winning and losing. Do you take it, or do you drive more cautiously, knowing that the margin of victory will be thinner, but perhaps being able to bank on the computer driver screwing up? Collision physics also applies to the AI, so there's a deliberate effort in the design to make sure there's no difference between the controller input of an AI vehicle or a user-controlled vehicle. AI don't have skills or abilities the player doesn't have, they follow the same physics as the rest of us. So if an AI racer takes a corner too fast or hits something they shouldn't, they'll spin out and lose momentum, which you can exploit. It makes it feel like you're actually racing against other people. Secondly, as the game progresses and you unlock more vehicles, you gain more tools to work with. Remember when I said games like Dead Rising are good examples of difficulty because they give you lots of tools to approach problems with? There will be a test at the end of this chapter. Losing needs to be a learning opportunity. You need to figure out where you went wrong and have the tools to fix it. You need to be able to make choices that allow you to play around hard scenarios. The nuanced physics engine means Simpsons Hit and Run gives players meaningful driving choices. Driving approaches all come with their own trade-offs. You can brake and power slide through a corner and run the risk of shooting past the driving line. You can emphasize control by slowing down when steering, risking losing speed you have to rebuild. Or you can go balls to the wall and gun it through a steer, running the risk of losing all traction and skidding out entirely. And this is where the roster of vehicles has its time to shine. Maybe the 70s sports car is faster than the Farini, but the Farini has a better turning circle. Maybe the Chase sedan has less speed than the Farini, but the Farini has a more sluggish acceleration. Maybe the Bandit is more forgiving when it comes to power sliding and drifting, which means you'll be a bit faster in corners. I like to call the Chase sedan surprisingly speedy, because while it's slower than other vehicles, its acceleration more than makes up for it. Same with the Curator. It's a fast car with great handling. It feels really grippy on the road and lets you take really sharp corners without needing to slow down. The hover car's built-in understeer means it slides dramatically, but it means you can use understeer like Alonso does. It's part of the charm of Hit and Run. All the vehicles feel unique and have their own idiosyncrasies, like how Comic Book Guy makes the car lean to the side he sits on, which changes how it handles. It also helps you decide what vehicle is best for what mission or race. Maybe you lost this race because you were too slow in the corners and your current car swings wide, so for your next attempt, you choose the car that can take tighter corners without understeering. This is what makes Car Built for Homer, for example, a great mission car, but the Bandit a great racing car. Third, the game rewards you for learning how the levels are designed, and this is where the levels being linear loops with clear zoning helps the game. Linearity in a game isn't bad if it's used with a purpose. Half-Life/Black Mesa, yeah, take a shot, uses its linear level design and geometry to make combat feel more improvisational. It made you feel like you were surviving on a combination of wit and luck, and reinforced the idea that you were a scientist caught in events beyond your control. Holy shit, I didn't expect that to work so well. Hit and Run's levels are designed in a big loop for a reason. That's how racetracks are designed. It's a racing game. Road Rage's level design, having large sprawling areas to drive around, works to make it feel like you're taxiing people around a city. And don't get me wrong, I love the open world mod you can get for Hit and Run, but it doesn't make sense for Hit and Run's design objectives because it's a racing game. I struggle to remember my way around maps in Road Rage, and I don't think the game would actually work without a little location marker on the map because levels aren't interestingly designed. But that's not an issue in Hit and Run because the levels are designed as one large loop and each map has a clear zoning, and because of all the aforementioned Simpsons charm that the developers injected into the game, spaces are easily recognizable as well as signposted. You can't miss the Duff Brewery, for example, or the Power Plant, or Springfield Elementary, or the Quickie Mart, or Burns' Casino, and it helps give you a sense of the space. It also means that level shortcuts are intuitive because they're designed to connect back to the loop, because they're meant to be experienced by players who don't have the level layout memorized yet. Often shortcuts are obvious because they're marked with Buzz Cola glass, which you get to drive through, but if you're paying attention, and since the same 3 maps are reused, you really should be, you can learn, for example, that the petrol station in level 3 and 6 cuts out this whole section of the road. As another example, in Springfield Pier, you have an under-beach shortcut, and this alleyway, just between buildings, that's just wide enough for a car to get through. There's 2 ways you can exploit this route, either by shaving off a few extra seconds here, or you can take this route here through the C-spanker and cut out this whole section of the pier. Because this exploit point is narrow, it can be hard to execute, so the level design is also introducing risk-reward dynamics that require skill to utilize. Having levels loop around on each other means your knowledge of each level's geography is more intimate, and knowing where shortcuts are is so satisfying. You can pretty reliably win this circuit race in level 7 if you notice there's a gap between the tire wall here that connects the alleyway that runs by the Quickie Mart, shaving off this section of map. But if you mess up, then that can turn the tide of a race from close but possibly winnable into a a lost cause very quickly. And even if you do execute a shortcut correctly, the imbalances between the cars you're racing are still there, which creates the possibility they might close the gap on you. Maintaining a lead requires more than shortcuts. You actually need to be able to drive. You need to know when to gun it, where in the course maneuverability and control is more important than speed, when you need to drift, and what line to take to shave off a corner or pass someone on an inside line. This also works for time trials. In level 7, you can exit the fire truck jump early, which reduces the amount of distance you have to cover and saves time. Learning the level design is rewarded in other ways. The last mission of level 6 has you race a black car to the Duff Brewery. Now, you can race this way, but it's actually faster to go this way via the Springfield Dam. Oh, my delivery of cheese has arrived. Taken together, the physics and level design creates a wonderful tension in races, helped by the fact the minimap gives you the positions of the people you're racing against, so you can get a sense of where they are. This fucking little arrow makes me so tense. I execute a 1-2 corner cut and close the gap and take the lead, and Homer is still breathing right down my neck. There's a fun, fast and furious feeling in races. Winning a race feels good, it feels rewarding, learning the game shorthand or honing your skills. Close races feel satisfying. Losing a race doesn't feel unfair because it's often by a hair. Sometimes I'd be stuck in a race for a while and rage quit in rage, but I'd always come back because I knew I could win with a little more skill, or a different vehicle, or a change in tactic. Just like a photo finish race feels exhilarating, there's nothing more satisfying than executing a perfect handbrake turn to exploit a shortcut the game has given you. There's a great synergy between the game's controls and systems. The races are the closest the game gets to the design ethos: you're in control, and it's your fault. Well done to the driving game developers nailing the driving. Good job. The races are good examples of difficulty scaling really working, and the physics system helping hit the difficulty sweet spots of challenging but satisfying. But in the later levels, the difficulty curve slopes upwards without an appropriate mechanical compensation for the player or development on things the game asks players to do. This is where the limited number of mission types becomes a blessing and a curse. A blessing in the sense that a lot of the game's missions are built around this concept of rewarding skill. So the mission Skip to the Loo has auto pick up children, where the children are placed in areas guaranteed to fill the hit and run meter, and this combined with the time limit and the fact that if you get a hit and run, it's a complication that can cost you precious seconds, means players who hone their driving skills will be rewarded. But it's also a curse, because since there's not a lot of variety in the gameplay, the development of the mission types introduced in the earlier game are do more faster. That's it. Because the difficulty is largely artificial, player skill isn't necessarily able to compensate for the challenges put before the player. The game will just apply the brakes on certain missions to make them harder than they otherwise would be by removing the player's ability to choose the vehicle they want to use, which is why you end up with the final mission being this fucking piece of ass. You have to carry this barrel of nuclear waste across the entire fucking map in 1 minute, and I hope you don't need to sneeze, because this barrel of sludge is itching for any excuse it can find to fly off your car. And oh no, my friend, if you fuck this up, you don't have a harsh but doable time limit to get back to the power plant. The clock resets to a minute, so you can be driving along, making solid time, and then somewhere in Brazil, a butterfly could flap its wings, and your barrel of waste will detach itself from the car, and now you have to cross the entire map again. Or maybe this motherfucker will just ruin your day. What makes this a little bit more egregious is the physics. Remember the physics detour? I hope so, because we're using it here. Specifically, the bit where I said high speeds are more unforgiving from a handling perspective. For me, the cars which handle best are the ones which allow the player to push the envelope with how recklessly they drive without crashing. How tight can you take a corner? How well can you correct understeer? If you smash into something and get thrown off course, how quickly can you reorient yourself? How well does drifting work? And so on. Because the physics engine introduces high-speed instability that affectionately functions by reducing the frictional force between the car and the surface it's driving on, in addition to the already existing interplay between lateral velocity and friction that destabilizes high-speed driving, there is a second physics component that works to make cars less maneuverable at high speeds and in corners. So the last missions of the game make you use both the hover car and the World War II Jeep to deliver nuclear waste, neither of which handle well, and then someone decided to strap a fucking rocket on the back of the World War II Jeep to raise the car's speed in a physics system specifically designed to reduce the traction of a car going at high speed and introduce high speed instability for a car that is, to stress, already unstable. And you want me to deliver this payload in under a minute using a car that handles on hopes and dreams? Like, who the hell asked for this? Oh god, don't fall off. Don't fall off. For the love of God, don't fall off! This is what I mean by artificial difficulty. There's no way to play around the punishing time limit, and the game will do this constantly. Set to Kill, for example, is an infamous mission that's made harder by forcing you to use the Globex car. You have to destroy 25 laser gun booths and then get back to Krusty Lou Studios in 50 seconds. The mission's time limit means speed and control is mandatory, but the game requires you to use the Globex supervillain car, which is fast and light, making a slippery slippery car not respond to player input in a way that can allow for the player to compensate for the higher speeds they're going at creates unnecessary hardships in a mission with an already punishing time limit, which is why you can use the reset button when you're on the Globex ship to warp to the end of the pier and save time, pro tip. The interplay of the physics components also reduces how reliable the information you have is when choosing a vehicle. The clown car is fast and statistically one of the best handling cars in the game, but someone forgot to tell the clown car. Because it has low mass and a weird center of mass, it pinballs around after collisions. Part of the joy of driving in this game is planning what vehicle to use. It's planning your approach. I want to have the information I need to make informed choices about the game. That's what the entire point of the tutorializing was. The decision to design missions like this hurts other parts of the game. Remember when I said you often get a really good car out of the races? Well, guess what? I lied. The best car in the game is the open-wheel racing car, which you win by completing the level 7 optional races. It's fast, accelerates well, and the tyres are super grippy, which is good because this car is fragile. This car is really forgiving with high-speed handling, but it only takes a few crashes to wreck it. This is the reward you get for proving yourself, for demonstrating your mastery of the game's driving, and it's a really good reward. If you get to use it. The race car would be great for a mission where, hypothetically, you needed to cross the map in 1 minute, but you can't use that car for that mission. It would be really good for the other missions, such as Long Black Probes, or the other 2 missions where you shuttle nuclear waste from the power plant to the school, but you can't use it for those missions either. Outside of New Game Plus, there is, at best, 3 missions you can use the car to complete missions with, and the scope to use it in New Game Plus is limited too. If you got this far into the game, you probably beat most of the missions prior. The missions where this car might be useful, like Set to Kill, are the ones which force you to use a certain vehicle. So there are no opportunities to use the best car in the game. I realize I'm not like hacking into the mainframe or whatever, I just want some acknowledgement for learning the minutiae of your game. Also, remember when the developers basically admitted that parts of the game were designed to be nearly impossible? Well, I want you to keep that in mind when you read the mission failure screen's handy hints that boil down to, hey, have you tried not being bad at the game? Try Buzz Cola shortcuts. Fucking where? Hot take. If there is a skip mission function because a mission is too hard, maybe design the game so it doesn't need this? Just a thought, high-speed vehicle instability bleeds into other areas as well and prevents the players from truly playing around with the challenge of shorter time limits. Like, it feels pretty self-explanatory how a gameplay system that mandates fast driving would rub up against a physics system that makes your cars less grippy when you're driving fast. An observation I made watching a lot of speedruns of this game, and I'm going to keep turning back to the speedrun community in this video because this game is, in a lot of ways, great to speedrun, and speedrunning the game is perhaps the purest embodiment of the driving design philosophy to reward skilled and experienced players. Also, I love Liquid Wi-Fi's streams, they're so fun to watch.
Button, frig more like button, fucking... yeah, got him!
Anyway, an observation I made watching a lot of the speedruns of this game is that the preferred method for driving fast through corners is by nudging the steering input to make minor corrections rather than power sliding. In Liquid Speedrun, you can see in Lab Caper in level 6 that to take this road, he's making minor adjustments to the steering output. Occasionally, he'll use the e-brake, and even then only to bring the car speed down before entering a corner, or doing a short controlled skid to get a better line. You can also see the same thing in the races for level 6. And then I was pointed in the direction of speedrunner Sayans, who said that that was his recommended strategy for taking corners.
When taking a turn, try to neutral roll your way around a turn or use the brake reverse button rather than just purely using e-brake.
Do you want to know the best way to handle fast driving in hit and run? Slow down. No, that's not a joke. Power sliding, or trying to get a tighter line by braking, isn't a reliable maneuver when you go fast enough because you won't retain control. You need to slow down using reverse or coast the cars using residual momentum. You lose traction too easily when you need to quench your need for speed, which launches you into a four-wheel drift. And if you thought you could correct that using like counter steering, you thought wrong. It's very easy for understeer to snap into oversteer with your inputs. The high-speed instability means cars are just too slippery, which essentially negates these other two choices. That's not a risk-reward relationship at that point. That's a do you crash or not relationship. This is most noticeable by level 7. Intentional power sliding is entirely off the table at the speeds the vehicles go, so the only reliable way to corner is to slow down. Now, you could make the argument that this is an extension of the physics allowing a delineation of player skill. It lets skilled players hone their craft by knowing how to control vehicles. And again, one of the quirks Hit and Run inherited from Road Rage is that the vehicles all have unique styles you can learn. But if we compare Hit and Run to other driving-heavy games at the time that it drew inspiration from, like GTA 3 or Burnout 2 Point of Impact or Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2, those games utilize drifting mechanics far better to make it an actual choice between slowing down in corners or gunning it and using the e-brake to drift through them. These games run on a fast-in, fast-out principle. Bad drifting in these games will create sloppy lines and cost you speed, but good drifting allows you to save time by maintaining speed through corners. Despite the emergent property of the driving physics, that sort of interplay doesn't really exist in Hit and Run. I don't know, maybe I'm a worse driver than average. Although if you're watching this, Barry, this is what the highway code says about roundabout exits, you piece of shit. But a moveset you can understand yet can't execute because of the physics system might as well not be in the game. I know all this talk about difficulty is just going to invite games journalism jokes because you're all so very witty, yes you are, but there is a difference between challenging and unfair. Keep in mind, these choices could have been used for more interesting gameplay or to actually reward skill, but a lot of them exist as vestigial carryovers of business decisions that sought to extend gameplay time as long as possible. Case in point, an observation I made when I was doing research for this is that a good few said they never finished the game as kids.
Essentially, this game could be brutal, and that's part of the reason why I never ended up completing the thing when I was a young kid. The other part of the reason was because my game desk just randomly stopped working one day.
This is so notoriously difficult that a lot of the time my research on the game kept coming up with the results about how impossibly hard this final level is, and I'm only 10 years old and I just want to beat the game, okay?
Others have cheats enabled, like this guy has the stop time cheat on and the speed boost to do more damage when you hit a car. I don't know, I can't relate to not beating the game because 8-year-old Soup was just built different, but hot take, unless you're that DEF CON game which is making a point about how nuclear war is unwinnable, games should probably be beatable. Speaking of cheating, as part of the artificial difficulty, the game will just cheat. As Liquid Wi-Fi explains about the mission Wolf Stole My Pills, if you're more than a certain distance away from the sedan and it drops an item, you fail the mission, even if you're not too far away from the sedan. What the fuck, Nintendo? I'm glad I know this now, because I used to replay this mission a lot as a kid. I beat it the first time when playing, but when I'd go back, I'd keep failing to beat it because of this. Like, fuck whoever coded this. This is just straight up bad design. Like the handling aspect, I should be able to trust the game to give me accurate information. It shouldn't just lie to me. Other parts of the game have the opposite issue, where the difficulty curve stays relatively flat. The premise of destroying missions, for example, is quite simple. Get a big, heavy vehicle that can deal out damage and smash into shit. There isn't much development of these missions in the game. All that really happens is you have shorter time limits and the vehicles you destroy become a bit more durable, sort of. Not really. In practice, I never felt challenged by the destroy missions. There isn't a lot of challenge left after you figure out that the basic premise is hit thing hard fast. Possibly the most interesting variation of this mechanic comes out of the speedrunning community. Because how much force you can transfer is controlled by your weight and speed, and because unmaneuverable vehicles that get caught on terrain will damage themselves getting out, which deals a few free hits, a common tactic is to push the car you're trying to destroy into a building, and then use their e-brake boost to gain extra speed to smash into them for more damage. The second most interesting variation is where you have to use Snake's car to destroy an armored truck in the mission Quick Cache. And the word interesting there is slacking on the job. Wow, big, tough vehicle being rammed with fragile vehicle.
Subversive.
This is why speedrunners will herd the van into the monorail station to let the van destroy itself, which, yeah, is a cool side effect of the engine physics, but Quick Cache spicing up the formula in the most mayonnaise way possible either becomes an exercise in knowing where wrenches are or playing the waiting game. The waiting game sucks. Let's play Hungry Hungry Hippos. Actually, the game pulls this trick a few times where you need to use a weaker, lighter car to destroy a vehicle. Like, right after Quick Cache, you need to use the Farini to destroy the Curator car. And this isn't even talking about some of the game's more obnoxious difficulty existing as a result of being poorly designed. Like, platforming sections. The best part of any racing game. Oh man, I have a lot to say about the platforming of this game. Okay, detour time. Platforming. What makes it work? Well, a lot of gaming YouTubers will say that platforming doesn't make the jump from 2D to 3D. I'm guessing this idea has stuck about as long as it has because Zero Punctuation said it once and we all just took it as read. Like how we all hate Brutal Legend because Zero Punctuation didn't like the RTS mechanic, even though Brutal Legend is good, actually.
Oh man, don't tell me I've been slaying
good games
this whole time.
Suffice to say, you can make platforming work in 3D, like Phil from Marble Blast Platinum did. Who the fuck is Phil? It's just a lot easier to implement platforming in a 2D space. Thinking about Cartesian coordinates for a second, in 2D games, you only have to think in terms of X, Y coordinates. When Mario jumps, his position is easy to figure out. He is X distance along at Y height. You have your time to get to the full height, the amount of time you're at that height, and then your descent, making a nice jump curve. How this jump curve looks will dictate how the platformer feels to play. A long time at the peak of the curve gives a moon gravity feel, whereas a short curve will make us feel heavier. Big, high, short, or low curves are all fine in their own ways. What's important is communicating that feeling to the player so they can intuit if their movement and height is enough to clear a hazard. Assuming you can communicate this clearly, then you can use a very simple set of button inputs to get a large set of nuanced actions the player can do, and get the player to perform a series of complicated jumps and moves from this control set in a way that feels rewarding to pull off. When we transition to 3D, we introduce a Z-plane, which means your jump curve moves from this to this. These additional vectors of travel are additional things the game is asking the player to think about. Where are you landing? How easy is it to judge where your landing position will be? What do you have to respond to? Early 3D platformers like Crash Bandicoot functionally still have you move on an XY axis, and someone at Naughty Dog with a crayon lodged in their brain decided the smartest way to implement this system was to put the camera here. Like, whose idea was this? And why the hell did the hacks who made Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone on the PlayStation 1 think to copy this exact same setup for parts of their game? There's a reason games haven't emulated Crash Bandicoot platforming, turf Jesus. It was shit. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that the reason 3D platforming is awkward is less to do with moving in 3D space and more to do with the camera. Patricia Taxton, in her retrospective on Marble Blast, says that Marble Blast Platinum is actually very good at creating 3D precision platforming, which I'd submit is because the camera is free moving and can move within a dome. Combined with the ways the controls impart feelings of momentum and spin to the player, the level of camera control allows for the kind of precision platforming most 3D games don't. Mini essay conclusion, and I know this video has had too many mini essays, so I promise this is the last one. Since platforming requires precision input, the reason 3D platforming sucks is due to the way the camera moves, denying the player the necessary information they need to make precision movements. Applying this to Hit and Run. Radical Entertainment added an on-foot component to Simpsons Hit and Run, either because they wanted to create a more immersive Springfield, or because Sega sued Radical and EA over road rage being Crazy Taxi, and creating another driving-only game was legally risky, so they tacked on an on-foot system with a basic set of programming very late in the process, with a lot of pressure from Fox. But either way, Simpsons Hit and Run has on-foot segments, which I don't hate. As part of the aforementioned charm the game has, there's a lot of fun gags you can find exploring like this. In fact, part of the reason the game has as much charm and charisma as it does is because exploring on foot exposes you to all these cute references to the show. My favorite one is the rat milk above the legitimate businessman's club. This is also how you find most of the world's collectibles. A fun fact, if you turn in all the collectibles to Comic Book Guy, you get an Itchy and Scratchy movie. It's cute. My gripe is that the player doesn't have meaningful control of the camera, and the camera in this game is a crime history won't look back kindly on. So the Hit and Run camera is, for the most part, hands-off, which makes sense for what is a driving game, because you don't really need angles like this unless you're doing that despawn traffic jam. But a hands-off camera doesn't make sense for platforming. A lot of the issues come from the fact that the game doesn't tell you can rotate the camera. No, really, you can rotate the camera around the player like this to line up certain jumps and on-foot segments, but the game doesn't tell you this. In the Week 7 test notes, they make the observation that the game doesn't tell people they can use the right analog stick to control the camera, and they need to put it in the tutorial because people didn't realize they had some control over the camera, which makes parts of the game less fun to play. And then they didn't. I had to double check that. It doesn't appear in the tutorial, but it doesn't. It just doesn't. I watched the video of the tutorial from the PS2, and it doesn't appear there either. I'm gonna play the whole thing for you now.
Use the directional button or left analog stick to move around. This is called walking. Press the X button to jump and hold down the circle button to run. Anytime you're in the air, hit jump again to get a little extra push. Got it? You can go inside certain buildings by pressing the triangle button. Ugh, why did I agree to do this stupid tutorial? It is so boring. There are a bunch of these scattered in each level. Little surprises are hidden inside each one. Be sure to come back again to see if there's something you missed.
Ooh, brain like shiny thing.
Yeah, great. Those shiny things are called coins. Whenever you get enough of those, you can get a cool surprise. That's the stuff, psycho! And so it begins. There's some collector cards hidden all over Springfield. Find the other ones and sweet reward is yours for the taking. If you want to take a closer look at the cards, you can see them in the pause menu. And don't get your stinky fingers on them, fatty. Nobody knows why these things have turned up all over Springfield. They always seem to turn up whenever something exciting happens. I don't know what they are, but violence is always an appropriate response in the face of the unknown. Press the triangle button to get into the car. And don't take all day. This is the tutorial. Okay, homeboy, here's how you drive this crapbox. Press the X button to accelerate and use the left analog stick or directional button to steer. The circle button is your brake and reverse, and the square button is your handbrake. You know, just like every driving game ever. Way to go, Homer! You the man! Collecting wrenches fixes your car. If you ever feel like getting a new set of wheels and you're not picky, just talk to old Gil. He's always got a couple crap boxes to sell. Okay, around town you'll probably run into a few people I like to call losers. Maybe they need a ride, or maybe they need help. Whatever, the point is, once you've helped them out, they will be available to help drive your lazy butt around. Here's how this works. Milhouse, Nelson, and Ralph run a series of races around town. Complete all the races, and you unlock a new vehicle. Well, what are you waiting for? Feel free to get a ride from anybody you see on the street. We Simpsons have done a lot for Springfield, so it's okay to get something back. If you need to really put the hammer down and drive, you can always enter these time trial races. They cost a little to enter, but they have a mucho dinero payoff. Wow, you really homerized that car! But don't worry, just sit tight for a few seconds and everything will be as good as new. Why? Who knows?
No, I wasn't joking. I never joke. Not even once. Why do you think I took you to all those improv shows? For fun? Well, I didn't hear anybody laughing. Now, on a PS2, it might be something you learn organically by just pressing the buttons or jiggling the analog stick. And these games were designed controller first, which is probably why speedrunners use a PS2 or 360 controller for speedrunning the game. Analog stick inputs can help mitigate the worst aspects of the camera, but I'm playing on PC with PC inputs, and in most PC games, the camera is controlled by the mouse, because it's not immediately intuitive to think 0, 2, 4, 6, and 8 on the number pad control the camera, because why would that be intuitive?
The numbers 2, 4, 6, and 8 all have arrows on them. You fucking idiots.
Most PC games control the camera via the mouse. You can turn on the mouse look in hit and run, but the game doesn't tell you that either. So I spent an embarrassing amount of time thinking the best I was going to get was the fixed camera, because the game didn't telegraph in the tutorial that this was a thing I could control. There's a really fun secret car in level 6 around the Planet Hype building you can find. Oh shit, I always forget where it is. Just below or beneath the top, that's fucking helpful. I eventually did figure out where the car was. It's that blob there, but rather than rotate the camera to here so I could see where to land on the car, because I thought it was stuck here, I kept walking off the ledge and just hoped I'd land on it like that scene from Indiana Jones. Now, is it my fault I didn't look up camera controls and assumed the game didn't have them? Yes, but it wouldn't have hurt to put this stuff in the tutorial, guys. Thankfully, the game does have camera controls, so let's turn on the mouse-controlled camera, and at least that should— oh my god! Turns out there's a pretty good reason to rely on the in-game camera. It's like when you switch from the Lakitu camera to the Mario camera in Super Mario 64. Actually, Mario 64 is quite illustrative of where hit and run's age becomes important to consider. Purple Colonel did a great video on Mario 64's camera that I'm about to steal from, because in a lot of ways Mario 64 was a major leap forward which helped standardize how players would move in 3D space, and one of those components was the interactive camera system, where players now needed to incorporate camera into play. But Mario 64 is far enough back in gaming's evolution to have design choices which reflect the fact adjusting the camera as you move wasn't second nature. Even in early to mid PS2 games, developers hadn't fully figured out that camera controls were almost, if not just as important as basic control over your main character in 3D games. So for a while, a common solution was to have a system like the Lakitu camera. The Lakitu camera is an auto-adjusting chase cam, which has the focus point just ahead of you to create a quasi-isometric view, and will move to that point ahead of you each time you move. Mario 64 would take over the camera to let the player focus on the obstacle they needed to clear, rather than adjusting the camera. It does its best to make sure it's easy to pick up, and doesn't force you to constantly adjust angles unless you need to. The amount the player has to move the camera in Mario 64 is limited. The camera moves independently of player input unless the player overrides it, and even then they can only override it within a limited frame of movement. It also had the Mario camera, which sat behind you and could be used for precision jumps. The balancing act these early design choices are trying to do is be hands-off enough for players unfamiliar with controlling a camera to let them see their character and the world around them, and enough of what's directly ahead of them to properly navigate, whilst giving them sufficient control where needed to do more precision movement. In practice, the Mario camera was useless. It's too close to you and is constantly trying to orient itself behind you. It's hard to use this view to navigate the world or use it for precision movement. So you just keep the Lakitu camera on, which is better, but the major disadvantage of the Lakitu camera is that it tends to have trouble if you're near a wall or too close to a larger enemy model, since it becomes difficult to see. This quasi-isometric camera isn't always good at showing the player what's in front of them or coming up. The other issue is that since the camera is completely separate from the character, the camera has a tendency to fight the player. It's always trying to move to the position it thinks is the best position. The camera clips on terrain and gives you a limited view of the area you need to navigate through, and this lack of camera control makes something as simple as jumping in Tick-Tock Clock or Rainbow Ride an exercise in leaping to your death. Hit and Run also has the Mario 64 problem. The platforming is a lot more bearable when you figure out you can control the camera because a fat lot of help the tutorial was, but it still has a lot of jank. Hit and Run inherits a lot of growing pains caused by the game's industry's exploration of open-world 3D games, but it also creates additional problems for itself the Mario 64 camera didn't have, because the Mario 64 camera would move in ways to create perspective, whereas Hit and Run's camera struggles to do the same thing when moving on foot, because it has a tendency to get into awkward positions where you can see nothing, and doesn't always allow the player to correct this because it has a habit of getting caught in the environment. I couldn't move the camera here, so I had to almost jimmy it over the beam so I could see what I needed to complete the movement. To get from here to here, I really need to be able to gauge this distance, so I need the camera like here or here, but instead the camera is here. Now, pop quiz, how can I gauge distance from this perspective? I can't, that's how. Hit and Run's player camera also aimed to keep the player in the center of the screen at all times. This is fine for just traversing the world, but is awful for platforming, because it's very hard to make precise jumps due to the lack of depth this kind of camera setup provides. And this sort of design choice for the camera creates other hardships for the player. One thing platforming needs is consistency of movement, yet when you rotate the camera at the same time as moving, your direction changes. If I want to move the camera as I move, then moving the camera is read by the game as me wanting to change direction, which isn't what I want. I have a whole separate input to communicate that. This isn't unique to Hit and Run. When you move the camera in Dead Rising 2, for example, your character's direction of travel also changes. But this isn't an issue because A, Dead Rising 2 doesn't ask you to do complicated platforming, and B, the game uses an orbital camera system that lets you position the camera and correct your movement simultaneously. This is why the mod launcher has an option to replace the camera with an orbit camera. Look how much nicer this is. In lieu of any proper control, the game makes platforming a lot more arduous than it needed to be. There are many times where I'd like to center the camera directly behind a character or get a straight side-scrolling view, and it either just wouldn't move to that position I needed it to, or the act of moving fucked up my efforts to do precision platforming movements. I was up here walking on a fucking tightrope, and I'm pressing the D key to move only for the camera to rotate, and now the D key input that was taking me straight careened me off to the side. And I can't move the camera with the controls to ensure the D key doesn't careen me sideways because the camera keeps getting wedged on shit indoors. More often than not, platforming has no consistency because we can't control the camera in the way we need to, which means you either end up just inching along like this because you're not confident in your movement, or you pause, rotate, and then make your maneuver. Rinse, repeat. You know, as janky as the Mario 64 camera was, at the very least you had some control over where you were moving. Figuring out where you wanted to go was at least an educated guess rather than a blind act of faith. This would be fine if platforming was just for the optional extras, like for players who wanted to get a full flavor of the world. But for reasons I can only attribute to a vengeful Sega employee who murdered a dev at Radical and started wearing their skin to work, there are missions designed entirely around platforming in a driving game, with a control set not designed for platforming. In the final level, you need to platform your way up to Mr. Burns' office to get a map of where he buried the plant's nuclear waste, and it's just the worst shit. Oh look, I can't pan the camera to a better position to make this easier. Bad camera rides again. The mission Never Trust a Snake has a poo run around Springfield picking up trash for Snake's community service, and I hope the person who made this mission steps on a Lego. No, that's mean. That's mean. I hope the person who made this mission goes to prison in real life. The mission is the reason I only 99%ed Hit and Run as a kid. The skipped marker mission is staring at me forever. Fuck this mission. I hate it so much. And fuck you, C-Week 2000. Oh, try until you do it. It can't be that hard. Yeah, yep, sure. Great! When I was playing this game to get footage for this video, knowing at some point I was gonna have to do this mission gave me a sinking feeling in my stomach. 20 years on, I've still not psychologically recovered from this mission. Words cannot describe the joy I felt when I beat it. Finally. Move over, YouTube plaque. There's a new sheriff in town.
I've moved house several times over the last year, and I can't find where I put my YouTube plaque.
What really gets me about this mission is the arbitrary time limit. No, I don't mean like the 4 minutes 15 seconds you get. I mean that you can't collect these 5 pieces of trash any faster than 1 minute. A game that didn't have a nonsensical difficulty curve would have made some sort of reward for players who mastered the art of high-speed driving, or change it so you rammed into the truck and an item would drop. If you were good at this part of the mission, your reward was more time at this part. But no, this mission punishes all children, good and bad. And if you fuck this part up, and you will fuck this part up, the game was designed for you to fuck this part up, and apparently the devs who tested this also fucked this part up, then you have to do it again. All of it. In the middle of this fun romp about space aliens and mind control cola, I have to constantly be reminded I suck at the Keep America Beautiful minigame. Pro tip, collect the trash in this route. It's the optimal route. Also, when you're headed back to the DMV, go this way. Don't follow the arrows, go up this bit of unfinished road. It cuts out the entire segment of the map. You'll thank me later. In other areas, the difficulty comes across as very tacked on to create these exercises in tedium. At level 5, the WASP cameras get a shield, so you need to do this awkward kick, jump, and ground slam thing twice instead of once, and then they shoot 3 taser shots instead of 1 now, and then they shoot 5 taser shots in level 7. But they're not any more difficult to deal with though. Most of the issues dealing with them come from the camera movement, so get used to seeing a lot of this. Oh wow, this is engaging. According to Liquid Wi-Fi, who knows this game better than I know my dad, whether or not the wasps have collision is based on the lust for life the wasp has at the point you trigger its spawn. So you can throw inconsistent wasps collisions into the mix as well. Speaking of coins, the game will lock you behind a virtual paywall for certain missions if you don't have certain outfits or vehicles, which require coins that can be exchanged for goods and services. The way you earn coins is essentially the same. Break these crates, cameras, and vending machines. This is fine for the lower levels where outfits and cars are cheap, but when I need things from like level 5? Forget it. I thought I was being relatively conservative with my coins and spending. Like, you can see I got what feels like a healthy amount of money, but by the time I get to Apu and had to buy the car built for Homer, I was broke. Ease of getting coins stays the same, but prices of wares? Woof. Collecting coins through smashing wasps and boxes becomes a bit of a slog because they don't have high payouts. I mean, we can't have the game go too quickly.
One of the very few things that I think doesn't hold up very well is there are, I don't know how to describe it. They almost seem like artificial playtime lengtheners or kind of arbitrary blocks. For sure. Yeah. To progress a mission, most of the time on each level, you have to reach a certain number of coins to buy a certain outfit for Marge, let's say the police officer's outfit, or Homer's car. And so you're often left midway through a level going, I don't have enough coins. Where am I going to get 400 coins from? Was that intentional? What was the reasoning behind that particular decision?
Absolutely, it's totally intentional.
It's extensions all the way down. Any fun momentum the game might build suddenly has to be stopped for the sake of extending playtime by going on these coin collecting missions. The Hit and Run speedrun community has a shared optimal coin collecting strategy in a Google Doc and essentially hoard coins for mission critical items only, which kind of robs some of the fun from the game. Like, say I get bored of being Lisa and decide to become a monster instead. That choice to enjoy the more playful aspects of the game will detriment me down the line if I run low on coins and I'm prevented from playing the next mission.
Actually, coins rob fun from the other parts of the game as well. Remember when I said you often get a really good car out of the races? Well, guess what? I lied! Again, the reason I use the level 2 racing footage is because the Electoris is the car you win in level 1, and it's a solid car for the missions in level 2, so the relationship holds up early game, but this begins to break down at higher levels. The El Carro Loco is the car you win by beating all of the level 5 races, but at this point in the game, you have better cars available to you, like the police car, or the car built for Homer, which you buy with coins! So the game doesn't reward your driving skill with better cars, it rewards your Sigma grind set.
The world record holder for the fastest 100% of this game, Liquid Wi-Fi, has a bounty for whoever can figure out how to get coins you need to fully complete Simpsons Hit and Run in a faster time than 20 minutes. I'm not even kidding. 20 minutes of this guide speedrun is farming coins. I mean, I still watched it all. The most bearable, read fun, way to earn money are the wager races, because they have a mucho dinero payout, and the payouts increase with each level and wager race difficulty. Difficulty is allocated by the vehicle you drive, so slower vehicles make for harder wagers, but they come with bigger payouts. This is fun because the game is leaning on the strengths of its already pretty good driving systems and mechanics, but the wager race difficulty will have the same difficulty as... The wager race difficulty has the same problem as the rest of the game's difficulty curve, where it can take several goes to get one good run, which ends up just being a break even for you, and forces you to go back on your grind. Please, Stop the grind. I want to get off. I do not dream of building a gaslight gatekeep girl boss empire. I do not dream of labor. Anyway, this was an embarrassingly long time to talk about the game's difficulty and its relation to everything else. How do I sum it up? The parts where the difficulty works best are the parts where there's a clear understanding about what the game's engine can do, and stages are designed with this understanding in mind. But by and large, the difficulty curve of Simpsons Hit and Run swings drastically between obnoxious and basic because it was designed to cater for a business ecosystem that doesn't exist anymore. Gamers are a lot older now and have disposable income, so games don't need to last you days or weeks or months, and the economics for designing a game have completely changed. And I actually don't know how I feel about that. Part of why this game sticks in my brain is the difficulty. Going into this, I remembered the controller throwing frustration I felt as a kid more than the joy I felt when I actually beat a mission. But now those moments of joy and satisfaction of beating something really hard are clearer. It's definitely something I struggle to find in modern games. Punishing games tap into a very stubborn part of my brain. Well, no, they tap into the spite part of my brain. Like, I'm not letting myself be beaten by a few lines of code. But I don't think the elation of beating a hard section compensates for the frustration I felt in the moment. When I think of fun, tough games I play now, the key difference is that when you drill into them, there's a deep set of tools and mechanics designed to reward player skill and planning. Elden Ring is hard, but it's designed to make the challenge worthwhile. If one part of the game is too hard, you can do other stuff, hone your skills, and come back. It's a shame we don't have more games to scratch that particular itch, but I can acknowledge that while also acknowledging Simpsons Hit and Run's difficulty as a byproduct of existing solely to extend runtime in the most cost-efficient way possible is shallow and ill thought out, which makes parts of the game which have thought about how to make the game tough in a challenging and fun way even sadder. It's a hint of what could have been done with a bit more thought.
We're through the looking glass here, people.
So, that's Hit and Run. I mean, if you ignore all the ways this video went wildly off the rails to produce either a fascinating work of unexpectedly vast scope that explores the multifarious worlds in which Hit and Run exists, or a video equivalent of wading through porridge, I am so sorry. A game that perfectly captures the spirit of Golden Age Simpsons with surprisingly nuanced driving physics that's better than GTA 3's in many respects, with some truly great moments when it's firing on all cylinders. Really? Our first car metaphors on page... 63, but a mostly repetitive gameplay loop and an all-over-the-place difficulty curve mandated by corporate ghouls 20 years ago. So, why did I make this? Well, it's my channel, I can do what I want. Seriously though, I entered this with the mindset of trying to answer the question of whether Hit and Run is still good, and yeah, if you love The Simpsons and enjoy racing games, this is a great game. I had a great time reliving this. But this game isn't like GoldenEye, where you don't need to have seen GoldenEye to enjoy it, or even to appreciate the creative quirks that come about because you're designing games for the N64. See Errant Signal's retrospective on that. Simpsons Hit and Run isn't the kind of game where you can go in blind. The strongest parts of the game come from the fact it was written by actual Simpsons writers and voiced by actual Simpsons characters, and all the charm it oozes is a celebration of the golden age of The Simpsons. If you take that out, then no, it's not a good game. Not if you think a repetitive and basic gameplay loop sounds kinda dull, and not if you don't enjoy fighting against missions designed to be impossible to do. Those kinds of things aren't offset by the level of organic fun the game creates with its open world and driving systems. Which I guess follows on to the next question, does this game need a remake? Yeah, I think this game should be remastered. YouTuber Rubes is doing a remaster of this game that is truly incredible. I mean, seriously, look how nice this is. I'd say hire fans, lol, as a reference to that tweet, but this is actually the one case where you should hire fans. Rubes has done some amazing work here, and Corey the artist who designed all the new textures too, her work is fantastic. Seriously, watching him not only remaster the game, but add in functionality has been so amazing to watch. Like, I've been following this since he started this project. It's been really cool seeing him figure out how these systems are implemented, and watching this series really made me wish I could play Rube's version of this game. But my statement at the beginning still holds true. The game's issues are a lot deeper than what can be fixed with a frankly amazing graphical overhaul. And I don't know what you do to fix the game's more fundamental issues in design. Creating a more reasonable difficulty curve would solve the grindier aspects of the game. The mod launcher massively improves the camera, so that's a plus, but the game loses a lot of its staying power without that difficulty. And without that harsh difficulty, the gameplay loop is simultaneously tedious and bare bones. Taking out the toughness would rob Hit and Run of a lot of its memorability. It would lose the elation you feel when you beat something punishing. The Donut Team modders have certainly tried expanding in the game, and God bless their hard work otherwise, but even the more interesting ideas are iterations of the same things the game missions already do. Even my favorite mod, Steamed Hams, you can't add the same features to Hit and Run that GTA has without changing the character of the game itself. Like, what, you want Homer doing killing frenzy missions? And any expansion of the game's length of material would have to contend with the fact The Simpsons is an entirely different franchise now. Hit and Run celebrates the earlier seasons, and it's hard to understate just how good the first 12 seasons of the show are, as well as the sheer amount of goodwill they still command. If The Simpsons game is anything to go by, outlook not so good for a game ever recapturing that lightning in a bottle. Everyone wants to ride the monorail, no one wants to ride the Gaga train. I haven't had much chance to talk about this in the video, but the fact that this game exists at all and is as good as it is something of a miracle. Despite its cult-like status and active modder community, this game's development is surprisingly ill-documented. The only real source of information comes from the documentation leak, and that doesn't tell the story of a smooth-sailing project. The game is held together with a surprising amount of spit and tape. When looking at the code to double check it with a Patreon, they pointed out that you can watch the sanity of developers deteriorate as the code goes on. They have variables called hack bullshit, magic shit, and default break scale that Plum is happy with. Who is Plum?
The spit and tape nature of the game's code and physics has knock-on effects for the gameplay. Speedrunner I should have checked how I say that handle before I recorded this. Brought up the wonky driving aspect to the physics. The botched nature of the physics engine means it doesn't update properly, so when a car is created, there's a chance their inertial yaw has an invalid not a number value, meaning a car's inertia is set to its weight. It's the same junk that creates the 50-50 chance of the baby van having its center of mass in the wrong place and was discovered by the same guy. They made a great video showing how this affects driving that I'm using here, but they make the salient point that a physics engine with that kind of inbuilt jank will also stop more nuanced expressions of player skill. There's a pretty good likelihood a player would encounter a moment where the physics engine just suddenly decides to break, and then they're dealing with a car that's significantly harder to handle through no fault of their own. And that glitch doesn't go away with mission resets, you have to summon a whole new vehicle. This sort of glitch probably slipped through the cracks because of the immense pressure the Radical team were under to get the game out the door.
Things at higher level were worse. Fox insisted that the Radical developers implement the gameplay that the writers wrote, despite them having no idea what the game even was. Fox was late delivering writer's notes, large chunks of the game were still in pre-production well into development. I think this quote from a dev milestone document is pretty telling.
We need to be able to design the game. Not the Fox writers, not the Fox producers. We have an extremely skilled team and a very challenging goal. Dual genre game. We don't have enough time to pull it off, but nonetheless, we have a shot because of the caliber of the team. However, if we succumb to feature creep under the pressure of Fox, we will fail. God, dude, I just love crunch culture.
Carrie, it's a lot of rosy memories here and talking about how nostalgic everybody is for the game. When you think back on that overall game's development, like how do you feel about it?
Oh, it's a mixed bag, right? Like we were young and stupid, right? We did things to ourselves that I recommend to kids getting into the industry to never ever do. Don't work that hard.
It was miserable.
We punished ourselves out of love for the product and really get this thing out. And so it's good. I don't think I would change what I did. Many, many long hours. Yeah. But I don't recommend it to anybody else these days. It's bad for your body.
The reason level 7 is half the size it is because, according to senior game designer Joe McGinn, they just didn't have enough time to make it. They needed to make the workload more manageable for the artists. Quite late in the development, Des was saying the gameplay was stale and boring and lacked depth because they weren't able to see the ways all the parts of the game would eventually work together. Reading the milestone documents, the expectations of the team were clearly whittled down to the point many of them thought the game would flop. But it didn't. It sold really well, and deservedly so. It deserves to be properly archived and preserved. The Simpsons Hit and Run is a classic video game, a time capsule of how good The Simpsons used to be and what this once fledgling medium used to look like.
But the world has passed it by.
Sorry, I'm late. There was trouble at the Simon Psychom with the running and the talking and the crying, and somebody tried to fight my Hawaiian orcs, but like with their fists and not with dice and their own models. Wait, please, come back. I have a funny way to explain the game physics if you just listen. I even wrote theme music. Listen, okay. I'm Simon Clark, a doctor, and I live in Bath. I like to explain physics and then do the thing with the dice and... Oh boy. I should really just make that video about the AMOC collapse, shouldn't I? You know, well, it hasn't collapsed yet. It's collapsing. We know that. With the freezing and the crying and the day after tomorrow and the death of the biosphere in Western Europe. I should really finish off those Hawaiian orcs. I hope that's not too dark. I just realised you said talk about anything. Just really go to town. I did with depression. I felt like that was all right. I thought it was pretty good actually. Sorry, I'm very tired. We're not sleeping very well at the moment. It's the sleep regression for the baby, not us. Well, it's kind of us by, you know, like proxy. Anyway,
Hey everyone, thanks for watching all the way through. This was embarrassingly long. I'm sorry it took so long to make. 2023 was a bit of a misfire of a year for me. I had a lot going on. But I will be getting back into making things again, including a very fun collab that should be out very soon, or now, depending on when you see this. I'd say I won't make anything this long again, or take this long to make something, but my patrons voted for a deep dive into the history of atomic weapons after the Second World War for the next video. I broke the script for that into 2 parts, and when I crunched the numbers on that script, the 2 parts work out to about 2 Oppenheimers worth of content. So you can look forward to that. Speaking of Patreon, thanks to all the people who pledged, who you can see on the screen now. Your support really is invaluable and it means the world. I wasn't able to get all of the Moop Doodles out on time for people, and some people haven't requested any, so if you're represented by a, who's that Pokemon Moop in the credit, then, please message me for a custom one on the Patreon. I know it's not really ideal, but I didn't really want to delay the video any more than it already has been, so, don't worry, you can still get one. It should be ready for the next one, and it will be yours to keep forever. Right, I'm gonna go and hibernate for a while, so stay safe, eat clean, lift heavy, and remember to register to vote.